Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out to talk about, or for our Federal Issues Forum, to talk about the important issues that impact us here in Nebraska. And we all ought to be very grateful that we live in Nebraska. Things work here in Nebraska, by and large. And the rest of the nation has a lot to learn from what we have to offer here in Nebraska. You know, here in Nebraska, we work together to solve our problems. We collaborate. And we always try to do what's best for people. And by doing that, we've created a lot of opportunity for folks here in Nebraska. And that's why I say Nebraska is what America is supposed to be. We truly have a lot to offer. And as a U.S. Senator, what we've been doing is trying to take the things that we do well here in Nebraska and bring it to Washington, D.C., so we can share that with the rest of the nation. I'm going to hit upon some of those things we've been working on. They fall into kind of the categories of things we did while I was governor that were successful here and I'm bringing to Washington, D.C. Just in general, also how we ran government better here in Nebraska, right? Through things like our Lean Six Sigma and so forth. And then also, one of the main roles for government is keeping people safe. And then I'll also hit upon a little bit of some of the other issues, and then we're going to have a great series of panelists that are going to be coming up here. We've got 3 panels. Our first one is going to be talking about regulation, but we'll also have some other panels that we'll talk about just in a minute, and we'll, as we get into the day here. When it comes to some of the things that we did here in Nebraska, there were some of our ideas about how we can make people's lives better. So for example, one of the things that we had here in Nebraska, we called our SNAP Next Step Act. And what we did is we offered our job coaches in our Department of Labor to our families on the SNAP program, or otherwise known as food stamps, to be able to help them get better jobs. You know, give them training on how to look for a job, write a resume, do an interview. And for the families that went through that program, we were able to increase their income by about $25,000. And about 60% of those families eliminated their need for food stamps. And so in Washington, D.C., I've introduced the SNAP Next Step Act to be able to help other states adopt what we did here in Nebraska to be able to help those families out. We also have a solution to help reduce our impact on the environment, right? We all want to reduce our impact on the environment. Well, here in Nebraska, it's about our biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel. We promoted that here in Nebraska, and I'm working with senators in Washington, D.C., for example, with the Flex Fuel Fairness Act. And what that does is it gives flex fuel vehicles the same relative tax break that electric vehicles are getting. And one of the nice things about flex fuel vehicles, right, we already have a distribution system to be able to fuel them up. They're called gas stations, right? We don't have to build all these chargers to be able to use them. So that's another example of how we're bringing our Nebraska solutions that are ready for America. And one of the things we did here in the state of Nebraska is that we managed our state government and our finances. You know, while I was governor, we controlled our spending. We reduced the spending. We only allowed the government to grow about 2.8% a year annually. And when we kept our expenses only growing 2.8% annually and our revenues grew at 4%, we had the ability then to make investments in the things that we wanted to do and provide tax relief. So by keeping our expenses low, letting our revenues grow, we were able to deliver $12.7 billion in tax relief. About $10 billion of that went to property tax relief through things like our property tax credit relief fund or the refundable income tax credit we did. But we were also able to reduce the taxes on Social Security, phase those out so we don't tax Social Security here at the state of Nebraska. And then also for our military retirement benefits. So for our veterans, don't tax their retirement benefits. And then, of course, taking our income tax rates down in general for all of our families and businesses. In Washington, D.C., I have introduced our Social Security Check Tax Cut Act to be able to start phasing out the federal taxes on Social Security to be able to help out our seniors. And especially in this time of stubbornly high inflation, people on a fixed income are hit the hardest. And so that would help them out. I also introduced our Tax Cuts for Veterans Act, which would do the same thing that we did here in Nebraska by starting to phase out the taxes for our veterans as well. So those are some of the ideas that I've introduced as your U.S. Senator into Washington, D.C. to bring our Nebraska-based solutions ready for America. Now, I mentioned one of the things that we did was really work to control our spending. That's a key thing that has to happen in Washington, because we are spending a lot of money right now, folks. If you look at just what's happened in the last few years, I'm going to start with using 2019 as our baseline. The federal government as a whole was spending $4.4 trillion. If you look between 2019 and 2023, that spending is up over 40%. And if you look at this year, it's projected to keep going up. This year, we are projected to spend $6.8 trillion at the federal level. That's an increase of almost 55% from 2019. And if you look at the different buckets, whether it's discretionary, mandatory, or interest rates, they're all up large double digits. In fact, one of the most shocking things is what's happening to what we're paying on interest. This year, we're projected to spend $892 billion just on interest. Folks, that's more than we're spending on defense. In fact, that's the single biggest line item we have in our federal budget. The only thing we're spending more than that is Social Security. But interest is the second biggest line item, and it's growing at 137% compared to 2019. It's growing 137%. It's the fastest growing thing. We've got to get our spending under control. But there's some ways to do that. One of the things we need to do is just get back to a regular order of appropriations. Again, here in Nebraska, every year the legislature works on our budget, passes it, governor signs it, we do it on time. We need to get back to that in Washington, D.C. One of the things that we're supposed to be doing every year, for example, is the president's supposed to get his budget out in February, his proposal. The Appropriations Committee is supposed to pick that up and then pass out 12 appropriations bills. Things like on Homeland Security or defense, agriculture. Get those 12 appropriations bills out to the floor of the U.S. Senate so that we can then debate those, amend those, and then pass those individually. Now, anybody know last time that actually worked where we got all 12 of those bills out and passed before the end of the fiscal year? It was actually 1997. Now, but before you get all nostalgic about Bill Clinton era, it only worked 5 times between 1977 and 1997. So this has been a problem for a long time. Last year, the Appropriations Committee actually got all 12 of those bills out. And then our majority leader, Chuck Schumer, sat on those bills, did not bring them up. In fact, he only started giving us a chance to vote for them after the end of the fiscal year, and we only got them all passed 6 months into the fiscal year. That's part of the broken system we have in Washington, D.C., is when we have leaders like Chuck Schumer who are going to play political games with our budget and not allow us to vote on that. And that's one of the reasons why we have all this spending. Another thing that Chuck Schumer does is he doesn't really have us work. I mentioned that he had these bills. He could have brought them up. We could have been debating and amending them. But he would end weeks early. He would start weeks late. He gave us weeks off. You know, most Nebraskans, we know we work until the job's done. A lot of us work Monday through Friday, and weekends if we have to. That's not the way Chuck Schumer has been running the Senate since I've been there. So just doing the work would be a great step in being able to get some of this work done. And then, of course, we also have targeted solutions of things we could do. For example, pass a balanced budget amendment. Here in Nebraska, we balance our budget every year. We have to. We actually, at the state level, can't even borrow money to be able to do it. So we always live within our means. If we had a balanced budget amendment, that would require the President and the Congress to do the same in Washington, D.C. Senator Mike Braun from Indiana also has a bill called the Fiscal State of the Nation Act, which would require the federal government to put out, think about it like an annual report, kind of like what public companies have to do, to tell us about the fiscal health of our nation, so that we could all make a better judgment about how our fiscal status is working and what we need to do to address the issues. Another one that we know is out there is improper payments. $236 billion is projected in improper payments alone. So I've introduced the Improper Payments Transparency Act just to have the Comptroller General tell us, how are these improper payments being made? What can we do in Congress to address it so that all this money is not going out to go to the wrong people? So there's lots of opportunities to be able to address these issues in Washington, D.C. And that's what I'm fighting for as your senator, to really bring some of these common sense Nebraska solutions to the rest of the country and help us fix some of these problems. And then finally, one of the biggest things the federal government is supposed to do is keep people safe. One of the threats that we have to our nation right now is our open southern border. We've got to get that border controlled as well, because 10 or 11 million people in the last 3.5 years have tried to enter our country illegally. The Trump administration brought illegal crossings down to a 45-year low. But President Joe Biden and Vice President Harris have opened up that border by reversing all those policies. They stopped deporting people, stopped building the wall, and importantly, ended the Remain in Mexico policy, which required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico till they had their hearing. Now those asylum seekers cross the border, they're quickly processed and released into this country. And the problem is they're not being thoroughly vetted. So for example, we had 8 men from Tajikistan who were associated with ISIS in our country for over a year. They were led in this country for a year until the federal authorities figured out, oh, we shouldn't allow people associated with a terrorist group to be wandering around our country. And so they went and picked them up. Jose Ibarra, you may recall, he's been accused of killing Laken Riley, the college student in Georgia. He's from Venezuela, came across the border, went to New York City, was arrested for child endangerment because New York City is a sanctuary city, they let him go. Then he went down to Georgia, was actually arrested for a misdemeanor of shoplifting, but because it was a misdemeanor, he wasn't turned over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and now he's accused of killing Laken Riley. That's the risk we have when people are coming across the border illegally and they're being released into this country. The cartels are coaching people on what to say so they get that asylum process going and they're released in this country. We need to go back to the Trump era policies. Now, we talked a little bit about the border, but another thing that is creating a lot of problems for us is inflation. In fact, that gets tied back to what we see with this runaway government spending. The Democrats have passed, on partisan lines, the American Rescue Plan Act, which was a $1.9 trillion bill. Then they also passed, along partisan lines, with just Democrat votes, the Inflation Reduction Act, $780 billion bill. So all this spending is driving up inflation, right? We all know it, we see it. You go to the grocery store, you know that grocery prices are up 22%, rent's up 22%. Electricity prices are up 31%. Gasoline's up 39%, right? We all feel it. In fact, the average American household is paying $13,000 a year more today to have the same standard of living they had before Joe Biden was elected. We've got to get the spending under control to address that. This administration has been the administration of high prices and open borders. We've got to get back to controlling our spending and get that border under control. And of course, one of the things I want to hit on real quick is the Farm Bill. It's incredibly important for us. Agriculture is the heart and soul of what we do here in Nebraska. It drives our economy. 1 in 4 jobs in Nebraska are tied back to agriculture. So it's important that we have a strong farm bill. To give that certainty to our producers, we have to have a crop insurance program that's going to be robust, conservation programs without strings attached, and we have to continue to promote trade. Trade is an important thing for Nebraska. About 1/3 of everything we grow and produce here goes overseas. And sadly, this administration has not emphasized trade. They have not tried to open up markets for our producers. And what we see is USDA is projecting a $32 billion agricultural deficit. Now, folks, there's no reason we should have an agricultural trade deficit, right? We are the breadbasket of the world here. We should be sending all of our products overseas. We don't need to be buying more agricultural products coming into this country than we're sending out. If we hit that $32 billion, that'll be a record. The previous record was set last year at $16 billion. And this will only be the 4th time in 50 years that we have had that agricultural trade deficit. One of the things that Senator Boozman has, he's the ranking Republican on the Agriculture Committee, is he's got a framework for the Farm Bill. And it does the things I talked about, and one of the things it's doing is doubling the amount of money we're putting into things like our market access program or foreign market development program to be able to make sure we're emphasizing trade. Senator Fisher and I had Senator Boozman here a little while ago to listen directly from our producers about what we need to have in that Farm Bill. This is an important thing we've got to get done. And so we're going to be fighting to make sure we get that Farm Bill done. It has everything we need to have our producers. We'd like to get that done this year. It's set to expire September 30th. It looks like we're heading right now is to do a 1-year extension, and then we'll pick that up again next year. We'd certainly like to get it done sooner than that, but it'll depend on some of the things that are happening in Washington, D.C. with Chuck Schumer. Again, is sitting on these bills. He hasn't taken up even things like the National Defense Authorization Act, which we pass every year to defend this country, right? So we need to have Republican leadership here to be able to start getting these things back on track, getting a regular appropriations process, getting some of these things done so we can address these issues with regard to our spending and then, of course, securing our border. Those are things I'm going to continue to fight for in Washington, D.C. to be able to make sure we can get done. And some of these topics we're going to be talking about a little bit later today. Now, as I mentioned, we got 3 panels. We're going to have a panel that is going to be talking about regulation, and I'm going to introduce our guests here in just a couple of minutes. We're going to have Senator Capito from West Virginia, who is the ranking Republican on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and then Andrew Wheeler, who was the EPA administrator under President Trump. Then we're going to have Congressman Adrian Smith, who's going to come up, and he is obviously going to been working for Nebraska for a long time. He's being elected in 2006. He's going to come up and have a great panel talking about trade. And so he's got some great guests there. We're going to have Greg Dowd, who's a former U.S. trade representative from during the Trump administration for agriculture. He's going to be one of the panelists. We're going to have Kip Tom, former UN ambassador for agriculture as well. And then we're going to have a third panel that I'm going to moderate, talking about with some of our producers here in the state about some of the other issues we got going on here in Nebraska. So we got a great morning and afternoon lined up for you here. We're starting at 10 o'clock here. We're going to get our first panel done by 11, and then we'll roll into the second panel. And so what I'd like to do now is call up our panelists for the first panel. As I mentioned, we've got Shelley Moore Capito, who has served in the U.S. Senate since 2014. Before that, she served 4 years in the West Virginia House of Delegates and 14 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. As I mentioned, she's the ranking Republican on the Environment and Public Works Committee, but she also serves on Appropriations, Commerce, and Rules. She's the Vice Chairman for the Senate Republican Conference, which is one of our leadership positions for our Republican caucus. She's a lifelong West Virginian. She's married to Charles, who is not a great pickleball player. Charles just recently broke his arm playing pickleball. But she's a mom of 3 and grandmother of 8. So let's give a big warm welcome to Senator Capito. And our next panelist is Andrew Wheeler, who served as the EPA administrator for the Trump administration. For almost a decade, he led the Federal Energy and Environment practice at, okay, so is it Fager, Baker, Daniels Consulting?
Yes.
Did I get Fager right?
You did.
Okay, there you go, look at that. And so as the EPA administrator, he led 14,000 people in the administration, oversaw a $9 billion budget with all aspects of setting and implementing national environmental agenda. Before that, he spent 15 years in significant leadership roles on the U.S. Senate committees. And most recently, Andrew established the first Office of Regulatory Management for the Commonwealth of Virginia and served as acting Secretary of Natural History and Resources. That's very impressive. He reformed Virginia's regulatory process, creating statewide efficiencies and transparencies, as well as creating the first statewide online permit tracking process in the country. And actually, one of the things that Andrew did, one of the things that we did at the state of Nebraska is we implemented a process improvement methodology called Lean Six Sigma. And Andrew did the same thing in the EPA, so I know he's very big on process improvement. Anyway, so thank you all very much for coming to Nebraska. Great, let's give Andrew a great big welcome. All right, well, please have a seat. Oh, okay, thanks. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about environmental overregulation. And we've got two great experts here to be able to help us with that. So I'm going to just start with a big, broad question for both of you, which is, can you describe a little bit about the difference between the last administration and how they thought about regulation and this administration? And you can take that anywhere you want. Andrew, we're going to go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. This administration hasn't met a regulation it didn't like and it didn't want to expand. We focused in the Trump administration of trying to reduce the regulatory burden on Americans, particularly small businesses, farmers across the board, because we understand that, and we understood and still understand, that regulations can really stymie business and job growth. And I think what you saw under President Trump was a lot of job growth. You had record high unemployment, and a lot of that was because of the regulatory processes that we put in place. President Trump had a 2-for-1. For every regulation that we created, we had to get rid of 2 existing regulations. Thank you. There's just one quick thing that I want to plug that we did that just surprises me that the Biden administration undid. EPA has all kinds of guidance documents. President Trump required us to catalog all of them and put them on a database that's searchable for everybody to see. We discovered we had 13,000 guidance documents, some dating back more than 50 years before EPA was even created. And during the process, we got rid of 3,000 guidance documents, but we put the remaining 10,000 on a database so that anybody could go online and find out what guidance document applied to you. Previous to that, you had to literally go to the EPA headquarters building in Washington, D.C., and do a search in the reading rooms through the filing cabinets to figure out what guidance documents applied to your business or your farm or your profession. One of the first things the Biden administration did was dismantle that database, that website. So that is no longer publicly available, but we had put that up there so that anybody could see what was available. And I think that is when you have transparency on regulations. When people understand what applies to them and what the rules are, if the rules make sense, great. If they don't, then you lobby your senators, your congressmen to get the rules changed. But you need to know what the rules of the game are. And that was a big hallmark of what we try to do, is provide transparency. And what the Biden administration is doing is trying to take away that transparency and having a Washington, D.C. knows how to do everything the best and just trust us and we will manage your lives for you. That's really in a nutshell the difference between our regulatory approach and the current approach.
Yeah, I think I read something also that President Trump obviously wanted the administration to start reducing the regulations, and that by reducing regulations, he was actually on a household basis had saved like $11,000 per household just in cutting the regulatory burden. And now, of course, we have this administration that's just adding on more regulations, so it's just creating more, it's costing households more right now.
Absolutely, and for the first time ever under President Trump's watch, the EPA reduced the regulatory burden on Americans. And the Biden administration has more than doubled that burden back up. We reduced the burden in billions of dollars across the board. And you're right on the 11,000 per household. And that's for all agencies. But Secretary Elaine Chao at Transportation liked to claim that she reduced the most regulations. It was actually EPA. We reduced the most regulatory burdens on the American public.
Not that you're competitive at all.
Not that we're competitive at all, no.
Senator Capito, again, you've seen both administrations here. What kind of is your take on, Environment Public Works, we oversee the Environmental Protection Agency, so you've had a front row seat here between the last administration and this administration. What's your take?
Well, I have had a front row seat at committee to see the differences in the administration when Andrew was administering the EPA and then what we see under President Biden. But I think what's the starkest difference is you send us to Washington, whether you send Pete or Adrian, and you have a great delegation in Nebraska, and Pete's on my committee and he does a great job. But when we write bills, a highway bill or a water bill, we all want clean air, we want clean water, we eliminate certain things we can't agree on. Remember the old negotiation, you negotiate between the Republicans and Democrats and you reach an agreement, and that's what we legislate to, that's what we write into the law. This administration, as contrasted to the Trump administration, if they don't get everything in the law that they want, they will then regulate outside of that. So they're basically trying to change the law or change the viewpoint of the law through their regulatory environment. And that's why you see it stacking up and up and up. And to me, what's the solution to that, and what has been the solution to that is somebody's got to file a suit and somebody's got to have to take it to court, and then it's going to be years before we actually get the correct answer. And you see this all through the environmental regulations that the administration has piled on. And Andrew is right. There is just the number of very damaging regulations that have come from this administration, particularly at the end here, in anticipation that maybe they're not going to be there in November, has really stacked up in the energy industry, in the ag industry, in the municipal water systems, and the state regulation. And the other thing, and I'll stop here, that I think this administration under Biden has done that the Trump administration did not do, there are certain provisions that Nebraskans are going to regulate their own. They have state primacy. They have the authority to make a lot of decisions. Nebraska does within the federal framework. This administration has decided, well, the Nebraska regulators really don't know best. So we're going to take it to Washington and we're going to regulate everything from Washington, D.C. and sort of skirt by the state responsibilities. And what happens there? The states sue. And you see some of these decisions that have come out, particularly from the Supreme Court, have agreed that there's been tremendous overreach. And one last thing I think that the Trump administration did very well, that this administration doesn't do at all, is a cost-benefit analysis. We all know that a regulation has a cost. And it's hard, sometimes it's hard to quantify, and sometimes it's this sort of unquantifiable thing that this administration will put a price tag on. And then there's a benefit. What's the benefit? And this, the Biden administration doesn't do a cost-benefit analysis because they know what it's going to show and they know what it's going to cost the American people, and they don't want that out in the general public because they know that will affect votes. And so I'm from West Virginia, heavy on industry, lots of natural gas and coal, and you can imagine what this regulatory environment has done to our state.
Yeah, Shelley, and on that piece about the cost-benefit analysis, that's not just neglect, right? That is a specific policy decision they are making, right?
Well, Andrew can tell you too, it's written into the law that you're supposed to do it. And that's what they didn't do, or they did incorrectly on the MATS, the Mercury rule in the early 2000s, or, under the Obama administration, they didn't quantify the cost-benefit analysis. So everybody makes their adjustments, very costly, billions of dollars adjustments, and then the Supreme Court throws out the rule because they didn't do a cost-benefit analysis correctly. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. And at that time, the EPA administrator under Obama said, well, it doesn't matter because everybody's already complied with the law anyway.
So you've already spent the money.
And that's the way they're doing these regulations. They don't care if the Supreme Court overturns them, as long as they force businesses to make decisions now.
Yeah, and then and that just goes to the point you were making, Senator Capito, about you got to take them to court, you got to sue them. I mean, that's what we had to do on the waters of the U.S. when they were overstepping the authority of the Clean Water Act, is we had to sue them. But to your point, it took a long time. We started that lawsuit, I think, in 2015, and just got the ruling on it, I think it was last year or something. So, I mean, it does take a long time to go through this process. You also mentioned something else. I wonder if you can just expand on it a little bit, and then Andrew, I want to come to you on this as well. It's just navigating between the state and federal regulations, and again, just the changes in attitude you've seen between the last administration and this administration.
Well, in certain regulatory environments, the state has the primary responsibility to regulate under the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And again, within the federal parameters. So your state, Nebraska, makes a decision, and eventually it has to go to the EPA, I think, is the process to make sure it's okay. So you have an implementation plan, you have a state implementation plan. So what this administration has done on one of their air provisions, it's called the Good Neighbor Rule, and I do have to say we have a member on our committee from Mississippi, Roger Wicker, and it comes out, and this rule comes out, it says 23 states their air is polluting another state. But this was the kicker here. Roger could never understand why the EPA is saying that the Mississippi air is affecting the Texas air, because we all know the airstream goes from west to east. So some of it makes no sense at all. And what they did was they said to these states, okay, make your state implementation plans. The states make their plans, and the federal government, once they see one or two of them, say, nope, these aren't any good, we're going to make all the plans, and we're going to do it all from the federal government. Well, you can imagine trying to legislate the same thing in Nebraska that you would in West Virginia or Texas or Alaska, and it's not the way our system of cooperative federalism, where states and federal authorities work together to get the best results, because that's what we want.
Absolutely. And at the beginning of the Trump administration, we discovered that we were sitting on several hundred state implementation plans that the Obama administration never addressed. They just let them sit there at the agency. So we went through the whole backlog, and we eliminated the entire backlog, plus we kept up with all of the state implementation plans that were sent to EPA during our administration. And Senator Capito is right on point here. What the Biden administration did, they started getting these state implementation plans. They didn't analyze the plans. They just decided, we don't want state implementation plans for this. We're going to go ahead and do what's called a federal implementation plan and ignore all of the state implementation plans that have been submitted. And they're actually losing in the court now, thankfully. But they didn't even bother to analyze what the states said that they wanted to do. They just assumed, in many cases, that they wouldn't like the state plans, and they wanted to have a federal plan. It's very much from the top down. What we try to do is we work with the states. When we did our Waters of the U.S. rule, which the Supreme Court basically last year, when they said no to the Biden rule, they basically said that our approach was the correct approach. When we announced that, I had the presidents from all 50 of the state farm bureaus at the EPA headquarters for that announcement. And most of those presidents told me that they had never been invited to the EPA building before. They had never set foot in the EPA building, and they welcomed the fact that we wanted to work with them to make sure that we understood what their problems were and what farmers' problems were on the Waters of the U.S. rule, so that if a farmer needs to do something on the wetlands on their farm, they know what the rules are. So we took a much different approach, where we tried to work with the states and the heads of the state organizations like the Farm Bureau or the state chambers of commerce, because you all know what you need to do here in Nebraska to improve the environment. You don't need the federal government stepping in and giving you orders.
Yeah, that's an important point. And I think one of the things that, I was governor for 2 years under the Obama administration, 4 years under the Trump administration, then 2 years under the Biden administration. And I will tell you, it was a night and day difference about the attitude that the Trump administration had. They were really federalists. They wanted to push power out of Washington, D.C. into the state. And it was just the opposite with both Obama and the Biden administration. They wanted to, as you mentioned, just start pulling that back in. Senator Capito, you mentioned something about the cost-benefit analysis. Can you just expand a little bit more on, like, how should we think about the cost-benefit analysis? How do we make sure that what we're implementing is actually going to continue to protect the environment, but not be something that's going to have unintended consequences or a burden or something like that? How can we craft policies that are going to be wise policies that are going to help our country?
Well, I think that we need common sense, first of all. I mean, there's the new provision out, Clean Power Plan 2.0, because Clean Power Plan under Obama got thrown out in court. Clean Power Plan 2.0 basically says, and I might be a little off on some of the details, but it will close every coal-fired power plant pretty much in the country unless you can carbon capture, unless you have the technology to carbon capture and sequester. That technology does not currently exist to an economic where you can actually do it. That's where you would take the carbon out of the air and sometimes sequester it into an abandoned coal mine or maybe into other kinds of geologic formations, or use it in some ways for oil enhancement, but environmentalists don't like that either. So so that basically is saying to the coal industry, you're done. Then on the new natural gas, meanwhile, I think we need to remember, and Andrew might have the details on this, our emissions have come down dramatically in the last 10 to 12 to 15 years. So we're doing the right things without all of this regulatory environment pushing it and pushing us to EVs and other things. And so on the new natural gas, you have to have a carbon capture component too. Or you can convert your coal-fired power plant into a natural gas one. Oh, when you talk about cost, of any of that, it's excruciating, and it's not just the cost of the developer or the builder, it's the cost to every single one of you, because the cost of your power is going to go up if you have to have all of this technology and all of this. So instead of looking at a transitional kind of plan, where maybe the plan is to eventually 30, 40, 50 years down the road to get to a certain, they're squeezing it down into these time frames that are basically impossible to meet and exceedingly expensive. And so what do you have? You have a time where we've got, I'm sure you have in the ag community, greater demands on electricity and power generation. We have AI coming on that's going to suck out a lot of our power generation. We have Bitcoin mining that is a huge power generator or user of power generation. And we have other things, data centers that are, again, so our demand for electricity is going up while the administration is putting regulations in that's going to really tamper our ability to increase and to meet this demand. And that's the cost. The cost is going to be to everybody. In terms of the benefits are having more clean energy, and I'm not against renewables or anything of that nature, but you got to have common sense. So it's quantified in, 1,400 less people are going to die, or 20,000 less people are going to have asthma, and I don't want to diminish that, but you can't really prove that, and so your benefits are a lot more nebulous to quantify than, at least in my opinion, than the actual cost of implementation of this particular regulation that's going through. So this energy one is really, really big. It's going to impact here because of all your biofuels and ethanol and everything that is used.
Absolutely. First of all, Senator Capito is correct. Our air pollution has gotten cleaner during the Trump administration. I'll just look at 2017 to 2019. I'll ignore 2020 because of COVID, because all factories shut down all across the country. But in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, air quality got 7% cleaner. We reduced air pollution by 7%. Air quality today is almost 80% cleaner than it was in 1970. The American public and American businesses don't get the credit for that. On what they're doing on the cost-benefit analysis is they are assuming that we don't need more energy. So that's what they're baking into on the cost side. They don't believe we're going to need more energy over the next 10 years, but at the same time, they're saying that we're going to have 2/3 of our cars will be electric vehicles by 2032. Where's the energy going to come from to supply those electric vehicles? And then I want to give just one example, because we didn't just deregulate across the board. Where there is an environmental problem, we actually increased some regulations, but we took a look at the cost-benefit analysis. And one area in particular was on lead in drinking water. And think back to Flint, Michigan, and the problem that happened in Flint during the Obama administration. The Obama administration didn't do anything to address lead in drinking water. We updated the rule the first time the rule had been updated in over 30 years. And one of the things that we required in our new rule was to test all schools and daycare centers to see whether or not there is lead in the drinking water in schools and daycare centers. Lead impacts, the younger you are, the worse the impact. There's an actual relationship between childhood IQ points and whether or not there's lead in the drinking water. So we wanted to make sure that our children were protected. So we did a new regulation requiring schools and daycares to test for the lead, because that was the important thing to do to protect public health. We didn't just deregulate everything, but we took a look at the cost benefit, and the cost benefit for reducing lead in drinking water is off the charts. It is so important to children. The younger the child, the more important it is. So we did things like that at EPA, but we also took a realistic approach as far as how much energy do we need as a country, and we need a lot more energy for all the reasons that Senator Capito just outlined.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, because where we're going next on this, I'm going to talk a little bit about EVs, but Senator Capito, you were talking about the Clean Power Plan, and my recollection is that we require coal and natural gas plants to reduce their emissions by like 90% by the year 2040. 90% by the year 2040. And I think, how is that going to impact us here in Nebraska? Well, about 50% of our energy comes from coal here in our state. So that's going to have a huge impact on like Gerald Gilman power generation station, right? Which means it's, to your point, it's going to drive up costs for everybody else to put the implementation in place if they can remain in place, because the other projection is it's going to shut down 78% of coal plants, right? I mean, so that's, if you shut that down, how are you going to replace that? And I think Administrator Wheeler, you said, they don't know. They don't have a plan. Actually, I asked Michael Regan at one of our hearings a couple of months ago, hey, do you have how much more power generation are you going to need for all these EVs? He's like, oh, we've got that worked out. I just don't know off the top of my head. Still hasn't answered it. It's like, really? You've done that already? You can't send us that memo? Like, what's going on here? So it is going to have a big impact on places like Nebraska if they actually go through with this plan, that shutting down coal plants and then some natural gas plants are going to be in the same boat, because that's going to drive up all of our costs as we try to replace that. On the one hand, as they're shutting down these coal generating plants, they want more electricity use for electric vehicles, and they don't really, there's no plan for how to actually do that. That's the scary part. But let's use that as a transition to talk about electric vehicles a little bit. And actually, Andrew, I'm going to go to you first. Just talk about, under the Trump administration, what were you thinking about with electric vehicles? Talk a little about this new rule, because you mentioned they want 2/3 of all new cars and trucks sold in 2032 to be electric vehicles. Talk a little bit about, what the administration is doing with this regulation.
Well, first of all, President Trump we believe that if you want to buy an electric vehicle, you should buy an electric vehicle. And that is a personal consumer choice. The government should not be telling you what type of vehicle to purchase. The radical environmental groups that are pushing this actually don't think people should own their own vehicle. They believe that everybody should do ride share that they have in the largest cities on the coast. They don't believe that people should have their own cars. So I'm not saying that that's the Biden administration, but they are following the lead of the radical environmental groups. So they don't care. The radical environmental groups don't care if we have enough EVs by 2032. So every mining project in the country to get the rare earth minerals that you need for the electric vehicle batteries, they're opposing those projects. So we don't have the rare earth minerals. We're dependent upon China for the majority of those minerals to build the batteries. We don't have the minerals. We don't have the battery production capabilities here in the United States to get to 2/3 by 2032. We don't have the electric generation. We don't have the utility lines. You know, they're fine building wind and solar, but we don't have the utility lines to get the wind and solar electricity to where you need it. And the environmental groups are opposing all the transmission line projects as well. So that, you know, from start to finish, we don't have a plan in place to get 2/3 of our automobiles by 2032. And if the automobile manufacturers don't produce 2/3, they have to pay a huge penalty to the federal government, which will bring up the price of all automobiles. So whether you intend to buy an EV, if you think you're in that 1/3, that you're not going to have to buy an EV, the price of the vehicles in that 1/3 is going to skyrocket, as much as perhaps double by 2032. And the environmental groups are fine with that, because again, they would prefer less people owning vehicles and less people driving their own vehicles.
Well, he put it pretty good. There is in the Inflation Reduction Act a $7,500 incentive to purchase electric vehicles. There is, you talked about overspending. I think it's $7.5 billion for this. Here's something that will make your hair curl if it's not curly already. I believe it's $7.5 billion for electric charging stations. In the bipartisan infrastructure package that was passed going on 4 years. It'll be 4 years, I believe, in November. $7.5 billion to the federal government. We've built 8 charging stations in almost 4 years. And this is the problem when you put the government in charge of a project. If we'd done what a lot of us wanted to do, was to move this incentivizing or whatever, or not even incentive, get the private sector to do this, which they would, because there's going to be a profit center, and they would already probably be close to being built out, because there are hundreds of thousands of charging stations that are private entities. So they never get to, they say A, but they never get to B, C, or D is like what kind of effects this is going to have, how much is it going to cost. And so the EV mandate, I think it will be interesting to see, and this election will probably have a big influence on this. Let's say President Trump's reelected and we take over the Senate, we being the Republicans, and I would be the chair of our committee, what kind of effects we can have on some of these really tight timelines and these mandates to consumers as to what they can build and what they can buy and what they should be buying. So it's going to be, this is going to be an important election from that aspect, because pretty sure Vice President Harris, if she's elected, would continue and maybe even double down on some of the things that we've seen coming out of this administration in this particular area.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, it's one of the interesting things that they're mandating more EVs, which means more electric generation, and yet they're cutting off the ways that we can generate that power. And I think you laid out really great just how crazy it is what they're trying to do. I've heard somebody describe they get 2 problems with this EV mandate: math and physics, and why it's not going to work. And you know, like in Nebraska, we've got 147 communities that are classified as city by the state. 99 don't have a charging station. 99. So if you're in places like Bloomfield or Alliance or Valentine, you're 45 minutes from the nearest charging station. And that's why, the adoption of EVs in Nebraska is low. Like I think overall it's about 7% across the country. It's like a little over 2% here in Nebraska. Because again, if you've got charging stations in Omaha and Lincoln, that's great. But if you don't in the rest of the state, that doesn't really help you very much, right? And the thing about EVs, if it drops below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, that battery will lose about 40% of its charge. Y'all may know it gets cold here in Nebraska during the winter, and so that's a problem. But it's also a problem if you have a truck. You say you got a truckload of cattle, you just can't pull over on a day like we're having today and charge your battery for 2 or 3 hours, letting the cattle just sit out there. You can't do that. So there's a lot of, think about, or tractors. Just tractors or combines and try and replace that with batteries. Just some of these things are just so impractical, it's unbelievable.
Well, I don't want to be on the West Virginia hills in the middle of winter in an electric vehicle out in the woods. That would not be a good scenario for anybody, and that's what we're looking at. You see the car manufacturers, we were talking about this earlier, are really pulling back on what they've decided. I think you told me Ford decided
not to
build their F-150, which is one of their most popular vehicles. And so anyway, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and it's going to cost them, a lot of money to undo those plans. It's kind of the point you were both making. Like the EPA makes these regulations, business tries to react to them, and it costs money to do that. And then they realize, like I think a problem with math and physics doesn't really work, and there's no consumer demand for it. And then so that costs those companies money, and it makes them less competitive with other car companies around the world. So we're really harming ourselves in a lot of different ways by trying to jam these regulations that just actually don't work, that don't make sense. And here's one of the other things, and maybe Administrator Wither, you could comment on this. My recollection is when the EPA assumes electric vehicle charges, it assumes it charges with 100% renewable energy. Is that right?
I believe so. They've been, and it's the same environmental groups sued the agency to get them to change the calculation for how they give credits for electric vehicles. So they want to give less credits. I mean, it really tells me that they don't want people to have vehicles, whether it's an electric vehicle or a regular vehicle.
Maybe I think these really radical environmental groups want is no people. Yes. Right? They just assume there'd be no people in the world.
That's freedom. Ironically, the big one is the Center for Biological Diversity. They want biological diversity as long as it doesn't include
humans. As long as it doesn't include humans. Well, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the technology things we can do with regard to environmental regulations that can improve the process. I know one of the things that I mentioned earlier, Lean Six Sigma, but and you in Virginia put the permits online. What are some of the opportunities the EPA could use if they wanted to make their operations more efficient?
I'm a big believer in transparency, and I've worked on that my whole career. I actually started at EPA as a career employee when I graduated from law school, working on it's called the Community Right to Know Act back in 1991. I really believe that if you tell people what the regulations are, if you tell them what the guidance documents are, if you give them the cost-benefit information so that you know what the agencies are doing, you can talk to your members of Congress a lot easier, and members of Congress will understand more what the agencies are doing. What the EPA is historically, and most federal agencies, they try to safeguard that information. They don't want to be second-guessed. And you really need to shine light. And what both of these senators have done in their careers in DC is try to shine light on what these agencies are doing. And we need more of that. And that's what we tried to do during the Trump administration. And we're going to have to double down if he's reelected on shining more light and being more transparent and explaining what the regulations are and the cost benefit.
Yeah, and again, your observation would be that that's one of the things that you focused on in the Trump administration, but this administration is really kind of going backwards on all this.
Absolutely. They don't want people to know what the rationale behind their decisions. They have this, trust me, I'm from the government and I know what's best for you mentality, and they don't. One of the things that, I worked in the Senate for 14 years. One of the things that frustrated me a lot when I was a staffer was the Republican staffers went out and I visited 10 different oil refineries all across the country. I went to farms all across the country. When I was EPA administrator, I visited farms. Every state I went to, I met with farmers in that state. You can't regulate an industry, you can't regulate a business if you don't understand how they work. And I can't tell you how many times I sat across the table from my Democratic counterparts on the staff that had never been to an oil refinery, never been to a farm. You know, they learned about it in college, but they never actually visited a business. And if you don't know what a valve looks like, if you don't know how they measure methane emissions from a natural gas facility, if you don't know how they fertilize their crops, if you don't understand that, then you can't write the laws and you can't write the regulations without that knowledge. And that's why it's so important, not just for members, but for their staff to get out and meet and understand what you all go through. And I think this is a perfect example where you have two members of the United States Senate here wanting to learn more about what you're doing and how you're doing it.
So, go ahead.
On that topic, one thing I think that the Trump administration did well, but this EPA, and it's not just the EPA, it's other agencies, they blow right through their deadlines. They have 90 days to make this decision, no decisions made, and there's no consequences for it. And it just goes on and on of these missed deadlines. And permitting, which you did a great job trying to help to streamline permitting. So we're talking about transmission, and even transmission for renewables. You can't permit that. You can't permit broadband. You can't permit large structures without this huge permitting process that is not transparent. The agency doesn't get back to you and say we have trouble in West Virginia with fish and wildlife, so you probably have trouble with it here. I could name the whole host of Corps of Engineers, probably Ag, everybody else that's involved. You can't get any decisions made because they keep going past the deadline and passing the buck. So we modeled in the highway bill something that the Trump administration said, which was one federal decision, which says if you have 6 different agencies that are going to be doing the permitting process for a project, it's going to funnel into one particular agency that's going to be the arbiter and going to make these decisions, thinking it would save time, it would get you through the deadlines. I don't think it's working. I mean, you can have all you want written on the paper. If nobody's going to do it, it doesn't do you any good. So, those are some of my frustrations, but I do think we've got to come up with a way as policymakers to have deadlines that then have enforceable, or at least decisions that are made if you go by the deadline. In some small cases, if the agency goes by their deadline, then that project is deemed permitted. But in this environment, we can't get that done. So there are ways to do it, but I think we could, and this also leads into the whole legal climate when you can keep suing and suing and suing and suing, and then they do this thing called sue and settle, and then the EPA basically bases their case on the Sierra Club or somebody else, Earth Justice, who's come up with their arguments. I'm sure you've run into that.
Yes.
We're about up on our time here, but just real briefly, since you are the ranking member on the Environment and Public Works Committee, can you just talk a little bit about what you've been doing to push back on the EPA and other agencies when they're doing this over-regulation, and maybe are there some legislative ideas of things that we could be doing as well?
Well, I would say Andrew's exactly right that the transparency aspect of his administration at EPA is vastly different. And one of the things that Senator Ricketts and I have worked on, and we actually had a press conference on, is under and I call it the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, because we know inflation is not getting reduced and it's worse. But there's a whole pot of money, billions of dollars, that's supposed to go for climate justice and environmental justice and go to groups, nonprofit groups around the country. When we dug deep into this, what we found that $50 million is going to a group in California called Climate Justice Initiative. And you go to their website, and what do they have? Anti-police, anti-border patrol, pro-Palestinian. They are a political group that has all of these opinions. Why are we giving them $50 million to help clean up the climate when none of the things they have on their website has to do with climate? So transparency, oversight is really important. And we have, I think, made some good progress on that in terms of pulling back the carpet to see where all this money is going. And you all believe this. If you have these huge billion-dollar initiatives, you know there's going to be some fraud, there's going to be some misuse of federal dollars. And that's why these big bills that you see coming through are really, really, I think, offensive to you and very difficult for us to track. So on the legislative side, I'm open to ideas. The other thing I was going to say before is another discouraging, and I'm an optimist and everything's positive that I try to think of, just like Senator Ricketts. That's why I said to him one of the first times I met him, I said, man, you're a happy guy. I'm sticking with you. I like that. And you have public comment. How many of you all have written a letter on a public comment or been a part of a group? Do you think anybody really reads these things? They come out with the regulation. They have 3,000 comments. Some of them are very, you might have a large group that has a huge problem with something, and they come out with the same regulation. And you wonder, as regular citizens, and me, myself, as a policymaker, does anybody really read these things? Maybe you could talk about that.
We did read them, and you are required to respond. We took a lot of advice from some of the comments, particularly on the waters of the U.S. The Iowa Farm Bureau pointed out that under the Obama rule, 97% of the state of Iowa would have been subject to federal oversight on the wetlands. So we listened to that. I do want to compliment Senator Capito on discovering that group out of California. EPA
That's not the only one. There's like 5 or 6. Yeah.
Yes. Senator Ricketts, in my introduction, noted that I oversaw a budget of $9 billion. The EPA, under the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called Inflation Reduction Act, received, and that passed party line vote. There was not a single Republican voted for that. EPA received $27 billion for environmental justice and climate grants. And all that money is supposed to, under the law, be spent by the end of this fiscal year. So they want to try to make sure all that money gets out the door. There is no way the agency has in place the protocols and the staff to make sure that money is spent wisely. And there's going to have to be some inspector generals, and then also a Trump administration need to take a look at how that money was spent. But I'm really concerned that some of that will be spent on get out the vote this fall and other activities that have nothing to do with EPA's mission. But they're more than triple the budget, the annual budget of EPA, and they're supposed to spend it by the end of this fiscal year.
Yeah. Well, to that point, and what Shelley was talking about with the Climate Justice Alliance, they got $50 million, and they used that in part to fund a march on Washington, D.C., to be able to lobby us for more restrictive rules. To your point, like, why are we paying a lot? If it's a political action group, why are we giving them money to lobby us? And of course, while they did, they're waving the Hamas flags and so forth. So again, it's just, why are we paying a radical group like that to come and protest us in Washington, D.C.? It doesn't make any sense. Administrator, talk a little bit about, I know one of the big things in the Trump administration was trying to get things streamlined. You talked about removing regulations, but also interagency coordination, because Senator Capito mentioned about, like, if you get 6 different agencies that have a say in getting something permitted, it makes it tough. Can you talk about what you did at the EPA to improve that? Are there things that Congress can do to be able to help with that?
Well, first of all, I worked very closely with the other cabinet members, and I joked about Secretary Elaine Chao on transportation, but she and I worked very closely on the CAFE standards during the Trump administration, and that was one of the, because the Department of Transportation has a part and EPA has a part, and that was the closest that the two departments had ever worked together was during our administration. And I worked very closely with Sonny Perdue at USDA and with Secretary Brouillette at Energy and also Bernhard at Interior. We really did work together a lot, and our staff worked, and we encouraged that. For example, we started what was called a water sub-cabinet, where my head water person at EPA worked with the head water person at Interior and Energy and NOAA and Fish and Wildlife, and they met on a monthly basis to work through issues to try to have a more and better coordinated approach. But I think what both senators have mentioned on the permitting reform, that is so important to have one agency that takes the lead. We have some experience now with that organization that was set up, but it needs to change. We need to get to the next level. When I was with Governor Youngkin in Virginia, we worked on that at the state level, and there are certainly some things that I learned in Virginia about how to do permitting transparency and streamlining that I think will be important for the next administration to take on nationwide. So it's all about streamlining and transparency, and the example that I always point to is the Empire State Building. We, as a country, designed, permitted, and built the Empire State Building in under 2 years. And today, the federal permits for that would take anywhere from 5 to 10 years if they can be approved at all. We have to get back to, and one of the things that we did in the Trump administration under the environmental permitting process was put a 2-year stop clock on the environmental impact statements. Biden administration has blown past that. They blew past that the first year. So we have to get back to that. There's no reason why a large project can't be permitted in under 2 years. And I think that's going to take some legislation, it's going to take some pressure from Congress, and it's going to take a willing administration who wants to accomplish that.
So we just got a couple minutes left. Administrator Wheeler, would you like to make any closing comments or wrap-ups or any observations that we didn't cover here today?
So much about what a Trump administration can accomplish next year is going to be determined by the lawsuits that are currently in the works on a number of these regulations. And it's going to be hard to undo everything in 4 years that has happened over the last 4 years. But one thing that we absolutely have to have is the political, if Trump is elected, Trump's political people put in place as quickly as possible. In 2017, Chuck Schumer slowed down the confirmation process in the Senate. My predecessor was confirmed in March of 2017, the first political person confirmed at EPA. The second person was not confirmed until October of 2017. That meant that all of the staff working on everything that first year were the career staff of the agency. We need to make sure that the President Trump's people have their people in place, because he's only going to have 4 years to undo a lot of this.
Capito.
Well, our committee does have jurisdiction over the nominees, and so that is a very important thing for us to have, because basically then if you don't have an appointee in that position, it defaults to the lifetime staffer that maybe has different philosophies than what the incumbent is, and so that is exceedingly important. I would just say, I'm going to go a little bit higher level here, because I think, more global, I guess. I think it's really important for, if it's the Trump administration, and for, I'm going to talk a little bit politically here, I think, as a Republican woman, that we focus on good environmental policies, that we focus on clean air and clean water. We get broad brushed a lot of times because we might oppose a certain thing, or we say it doesn't make sense, and then all of a sudden you're for making people sick and polluting the air, and you don't really care. And so I think having positive solutions, like some of the bills that Senator Ricketts talked about and that he's put forward, positive solutions to what we know are identifiable problems, are really going to be important in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm a grandmother of 8, and I have 3 kids. The younger generation, this is important to them. And it's important that that there's an alternative to solutions. It can't just be what the environmental community wants, or maybe a more radical administration would want. We have to have alternative solutions, and that's where you all come in. Because the best solutions are found right here, whether it's the state fair or whether it's in your businesses or your schools. And so I just put that out there because it's something I think about a lot, and I'm not the best at myself. And so I think that we need to be the leaders in innovative solutions, because we can innovate our way out of anything. But we can't squelch the innovation as we're moving along. And so that's what I think is important for us.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to close on, because I think that is the strength of our nation, is that when we have problems, we innovate our ways out of those problems. We need to allow Americans to be able to innovate to continue to do that. Well, thank you both very much for coming here today. I appreciate you making the trips to Nebraska to talk about these very important issues. Appreciate all that you did when you were the EPA. You did a great job there, Andrew. So really appreciate working with you. And Senator Capito, really appreciate being on your committee. You do a great job of leadership there for us. Can we give them all, again, a big Nebraska welcome? Thank you. Thank you. Thanks again.
Good luck.
Thanks, Shelley. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and call up our next panel. And Adrian Smith is going to be the moderator for that. And you all know Adrian Smith is our 3rd District Congressman. I've known Adrian for almost 20 years now. He's had a great career in public service here. Not only has he been in education and real estate, but he served on the Gering City Council. He's been a state legislator. And then, of course, now, since 2006, he's been representing us in the 3rd District for Nebraska, and just really does a fantastic job. I love working with this man. He's on the very important Ways and Means Committee, which is just an incredibly important position to have. So it's great to have Nebraskans in places where we can have a lot of influence on the policy that is going to be debated in the House of Representatives. So he's going to come up here. One of the key things he's worked on is trade, and he's a great advocate for Nebraska agriculture. So we really are well served by having Adrian Smith serve us. And Adrian, I'm going to turn it over to you to call up your guests. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Well, good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you, Senator Ricketts. Thank you to all of you for taking some time to join this discussion that I think is very important. As Pete said, I head up the Trade Subcommittee on the Ways and Means Committee. I'm very honored to have that opportunity. I think this is such an important topic. And not just because we're in the middle of supply chain crisis that is causing inflation, one of the causes of inflation, or I'm also interested in trade because I want consumers to have affordable access to new innovations. But the number one reason why I asked to join the Ways and Means Committee was because of agriculture export opportunities that I wanted to help create. Now, we've gotten some things done with trade and agriculture over some time, but not much in the last 3.5 years, I have to say. And that cost of inaction is very expensive. We have competitors around the world as it relates to agriculture. I think we are reminded of that more often than we would like. But the fact is, when we have inaction on trade, that gives our competitors more opportunity, more market share, and it's very hard to get that back. Very hard. So, it's interesting. I'll just say that I'm not a huge fan of tariffs, but I think they should be a tool in the toolbox. And when you have perhaps tariffs as a defensive measure, when another country is cheating, like China often does, tariffs are a legitimate and can be a very effective response. Now, we want to fashion it in a way and have a strategy to where ultimately we won't need those tariffs later because our consumers have to foot that bill. Now, as we have various trade policies, to know that if there's some tariffs in place, we need to have an offensive posture along the way as well. And that's what we saw during the Trump administration, I will say, is that trade, leveling the playing field, was so important And yes, there were some tariffs over here, but there was action taken in terms of developing trade opportunities with our partners. Renegotiating NAFTA then, now it's USMCA. A lot of folks said that could never get done. And agriculture, I appreciate, because agriculture, U.S. agriculture, specifically Nebraska, had done pretty well under NAFTA. And yet other parts, there were other concerns across our economy as it related to NAFTA, but U.S. agriculture said do no harm. Let's play ball here. Let's do no harm. Let's not lose ground from where we had gained, and I appreciate that. That showed, I think, the teamwork of U.S. agriculture wanting to move our country forward in terms of trade policy. Now, the one thing that did not exist in NAFTA was biotechnology references. So, with USMCA, we got biotechnology in there. What do you know? Mexico doesn't want to take our corn. A flagrant and direct violation of USMCA. So now we are in the process of disputing that posture that Mexico has, and that we can, I'm hopeful we can prevail on that. There's a lot at stake. The world is watching in terms of how we handle this. If we are viewed to give a pass to Mexico, you better believe that other countries are going to take similar steps. And we cannot let that happen. The rules-based trade is absolutely vital. And another issue that I think is very important is, the Trump administration teed up a trade agreement with Africa. And Africa is not a huge market, but they're part of a huge continent. The fastest growing population of a continent is Africa. And obviously, we're good at helping feed the world, but our supply chains matter too. Our critical mineral supply chains are important as well. And I think we would be well served to get us back on track to getting a trade agreement with Kenya as a precursor, hopefully, to other trade agreements across the continent of Africa, especially when you look at the demographics of Asia and how China wants to cheat. We can and need to see, I think, Africa as an opportunity, a trade opportunity, like I said, to just constantly be looking for more opportunities offensively so that we can set the agenda. And actually, the world many times is looking to us to set the agenda. In fact, during the Biden administration, they have done what they call the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They call it IPEF. I call it IPUF because it has no enforcement. It doesn't talk anything about tariffs and market access. In fact, more recently, they said, we're not even going to talk about digital. Now, America leads the world, similar to agriculture, with digital. The free flow of information is absolutely vital. We don't want every country in the world doing what China does, for example, on the flow of information. So digital trade is absolutely vital, and stay tuned for that because this is a very bipartisan issue. There are many Democrats concerned about this as well, and yet it seems at every turn the Biden administration says they want to talk about trade, but not digital, not market access, not tariffs. I don't know how much you have left to talk about as it relates to trade after you exclude those types of dynamics and issues. So today, I'm grateful to welcome some great panelists here. Many of you know our two panelists, Ambassador Kip Tom from Indiana, as well as Ambassador Greg Dowd from Kansas. And he's not from Kansas right now, but you're still from Kansas, right? Yeah.
Always from Kansas.
Okay, come on up, guys. We're grateful to have these experts with us. Yes. Let me just share a little bit of background. Ambassador Tom was raised on a family farm in Indiana. It goes back to 1837. Before becoming ambassador, he had become the ambassador to the United Nations for Food and Agriculture Agencies and the international organizations which had him in Rome during the Trump administration. Before becoming ambassador, he served in various roles in the family farm and agribusinesses. This involved production operations in the U.S. and Latin America, grain trading and processing, and investing in agri-technologies. Kip has also worked in global agriculture development. Today, he is chairman of the Tom Family Agribusinesses and managing member of Global Ag, LLC. He serves on numerous corporate and not-for-profit boards as a strategic advisor. He's always been a trailblazer for American agriculture, which is important. And he's always pushed for innovation, which we know helps production on the family farm, and it helps feed the world. So please welcome Ambassador Kip Tom. We also have President and CEO of the National Milk Producers Association, Greg Dowd. Before arriving at NMPF, Greg served as the Chief Ag Negotiator for the Office of United States Trade Representative from 2018 to 2021. Before that, he was president of the Commodity Markets Council, representing commodities exchanges before Congress and federal agencies. He has also served as a staff member for the Senate Ag Committee, where he helped write the 2012 Farm Bill. We try not to hold it against him that he worked on the Senate side rather than the House side. But he also worked as chief economist for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Aim Point Research. Greg grew up raising cattle in Mankato, Kansas. He might wear purple from time to time, but we won't talk about that. He earned a bachelor and master's degree from that purple school. That's not like red and blue purple. That's
no,
Wildcat.
we don't talk about that. No.
Greg and his family currently live on their farm in Lothian, Maryland. So please welcome Ambassador Dowd. Right, well, thanks again for joining us here. There's so much to talk about. It's hard to keep track of everything. But let's start, Ambassador Dowd. First of all, tell us about your role at USTR. I think it was a very productive time for trade, a little differently productive than perhaps some other more traditional, conventional ways. But talk to us briefly about your role and what that did for market access for American producers.
So, Congressman, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's great to be back and see everybody and be back home. My dad's right here. Grew up about 70 miles south of here. And when I used to come back and help Dad farm, I always flew in and out of Grand Island. So this is very much kind of a home base. Had the honor to work for President Trump and for the country on trade and agriculture. U.S. agricultural exports are anywhere from $175 to $190 billion. That was the portfolio of this job. We redid NAFTA, Canada, and Mexico, which today are our two biggest markets for U.S. ag exports. We did the China Phase 1 agreement, which for me was a year of my life. 33 negotiating sessions, hundreds of hours, duking it out with the Chinese to fix some 57 different things in agricultural trade between the U.S. and China that expanded our exports from 26 to $38 billion in just a couple of years. And then in the middle of that, we threw in what I think is one of the greatest trade deals of all time for the history of U.S. agriculture, and that's what we did with Japan. And in 6 weeks, we negotiated a deal that really kept us on par with all of our trading partners or our competitors in the Japanese market. So when you add up, those are top 4 markets for U.S. agricultural exports. That's over half of U.S. agricultural exports that, in Kansas Farm Boy terminology, we overhauled while I was in that job. So it was quite a time, pretty historic time to be in that role.
Very good, very good. Ambassador Tom, can you tell us, as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture, that's obviously a long, maybe you can give us a good way to abbreviate what you did and what that means. It's, trade is a big topic. I mean, as Ambassador Dowd talked about, it involves minute details that are very important. And tariff lines, for example, can number in the hundreds, if not more, in one agreement, if not the thousands. And yet, you worked in terms of the results of trade and had to deal with that. Can you speak to how trade impacts the world from your perspective? Well, first, thank you, Senator Ricketts, for having us here today. It's an honor to be here in Nebraska, and Congressman, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you and Ambassador Dowd. I can tell you during our time serving President Trump over USTR, what we were doing in Rome, Italy, but mainly around the world, is the amount of information we'd share with each other, trying to find those opportunities where we could actually increase agriculture trade in some of those frontier or maybe developing markets around the world. But my role is specifically focused on the UN agencies or international organizations. The first one is the World Food Program. Many of you have heard of that organization. They were focused on feeding the 1 billion people that are malnourished around the world at any one time. But typically, we're only feeding about 150 million of them. I say only, that's still a lot of people to feed. Those that are chronically malnourished, they're on the edge of famine. So that's going on in the backdrop. That's almost a $14 billion budget a few years ago. It's came back quite a bit since then. The other organization we worked with was the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's the group that is supposed to create resilience and capacity in farming systems in these developing markets around the world. But to be very frank with you, they haven't done that. I would travel across the Middle East and across Africa, and I can tell you they've done little to improve the lives and livelihoods and grow the economic opportunities for that smallholder farmer to not only feed themselves, but to feed a broader audience throughout the continent where they're at. So those were the two main ag organizations. We had 4 others we worked with too, International Development Law Organization, where we had 300 attorneys working for us. We were trying to unravel some of the death spirals created by the Chinese in Africa. We had another one, it was UNIDRAW, where Secretary Pompeo and myself signed an agreement to foster the sales of more mining and agriculture and construction equipment from the United States across the developing world. So we had a pretty wide portfolio, but the main focus was food and agriculture around the world. Very good. So let's talk trade agreements. We hear that's a pretty broad topic in and of itself, but there's bilateral trade agreements, so us and one other country. And there's multilateral trade agreements, which USMCA would be one because it's 3 countries. And so there's various opinions out there in terms of what can be most effective or what is appropriate for a given point in time. Can you speak to what kind of opportunities there might be, one versus the other, perhaps what you would prefer moving forward as well?
Well, a multilateral would be the WTO and dealing with the WTO. And it's been 30 years since we've done anything with the WTO. What you'll find today in that setting, and the economics textbook will tell you that's the best way to do this. But China and India, and especially India, block anything in agriculture. So it's very frustrating, almost a waste of time, honestly, to deal with.
And speaks to WTO needing some reforms.
And it's just, the difficulties of dealing anywhere geopolitically today. Those environments involve much more than just agriculture. So it's a great challenge. On the bilateral side of the equation, you have Canada, Mexico. We were also working on a deal just with Kenya. And you have many countries in the world that have looked at what we did with USMCA, which, a lot of people would consider that the gold standard agreement in the world today from a bilateral standpoint. The challenge is that you have to first approve trade promotion authority with the US Congress. You have to find countries that are willing to actually do what's on the piece of paper. And then you have to have a country that's willing politically to engage with us in all this. It takes a lot of political capital for us and for them. So it's a real challenge. And the multilateral with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other things like that, the challenge that you have with those is when you get 12 people in a room negotiating in 12 different directions, what quickly happens? You mitigate and migrate all the way down to the least common denominator. So by the time you're done, you look at yourself and say, what have we really accomplished here? And so where we're at today with all of this, and this is a conversation that I have with my peers in Washington and agricultural circles, is we need to rethink this a little bit and spend a lot more time. How can we specifically dial in specific markets and specific commodities and specific countries that don't need TPA, that where there's a mutual relationship between the two countries, that we want to liberalize this. There's investment going in both directions in specific sectors. How do we make this better? All right, let's cut a deal. All right, let's cut a deal here, let's go. Let's move this as quickly as we can, where we can, to make as much progress as we can. And I think that's really where we're going to try to move this thing going forward in the future.
Okay. Ambassador?
You know, what I would add to that is that, is from what we were doing in our mission in Rome, Italy, and working around the world, is we recognize these opportunities, but, at the end of the day, we have to be competitive with our product pricing here in the United States to get these deals done. There's all these trade deals that need to take place, but we have to be competitive. And one of the things I'm probably most fearful of today is how we have outsourced our supply chains in agriculture around the world. For instance, if I look at our crop care products, pesticides, 70% are produced in other places around the world. Much of that in China, one of our adversaries. Yet at the same time, we want to make sure that we can do a trade deal with them and make sure we sell them the products that we produce here on American farms and ranches. So it's very complicated, but when I look at it's crop care products, it's fertilizers coming from Russia and Belarus, right. Some of our phosphate was coming from China. There's a lot of our players that we work with that are our adversaries that we want to make sure we keep them close and remain their friends, but not get too close. So it gets very complicated. And I think this is where agriculture needs to understand, we need to continue to work to do more value-add production here in the United States to make sure we're stepping ahead of the Brazils and the Argentines and some of our competitors around the world. But at the same time, it's time we bring these supply chains back, create good-paying American jobs, and bring that manufacturing, knowing that we're a food-secure nation.
Right.
Without it, we won't be.
Yeah, I've been doing some work on general system of preferences, basically tariff relief with countries who want to cooperate with us. And actually, that gives us a little bit of leverage with other trade policies to say, if you want the tariff relief from us as a market, then you need to do X. And I think we've seen some opportunities there. So that legislation is pending. Also, back to Kenya. Actually, Kenya benefits from AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act. So, believe it or not, we basically waive tariffs for Kenya, and yet the Biden administration says, we'll talk about trade with Kenya, but we don't want to talk about tariffs. Well, they already have the benefits, and yet Kenya wants a trade agreement with us. And it would, as I mentioned earlier, it stands to reason that we could both benefit from that. And the thing is, around the world, people will tell you in these various countries that the cool factor, if you will, of having a trade agreement with the U.S. is pretty significant.
Well, so many of these countries around the world, China's invading. They're the Belt and Road Initiative, they're right. Inserting themselves all over the place, all over the world. Africa is one of the better examples of that. And these countries are coming to the United States saying, we'd rather do business with you. Will you work with us instead? And our ability to, or the amount of engagement that we've done on that, I think has just really been poor.
Right. What I witnessed over my time spending in Africa, I spent in Africa, was oftentimes what we see is the EU still feels like Africa is its colonies yet today. And they tend to drive the food policy or the agriculture right. production in many of the 54 countries there in Africa, with the exception probably being South Africa. But they don't have access to what we grow on farms here in the United States, GMO crops or gene editing or fertilizer, pesticides, So the Europeans will tell the Africans, well, if you start producing that, we won't buy from you any longer. You'll lose your trading status with us. At the same time, the Europeans are coming to the United States right now, and they're trying to, through non-tariff trade barriers, create a barrier mainly based on carbon right now, trying to stop us from exporting some of the products there. So, it's time we start standing together with some of our friends around the world, whether it's Brazil and Argentina, to make sure we aren't pushed back in the corner and excluded from having trade.
Right. That's a very good point. I mean, you mentioned non-tariff trade barriers and, other countries. If you could describe perhaps the perspective of another country, perhaps looking at a trade agreement with a little bit of skepticism, giving more access to us into their markets. Now, we lead the world in agriculture, and so that sometimes has other countries thinking, well, that they do that so affordably in the U.S. that they see that as a threat. Describe details about that perhaps, or how we can overcome some of these, or share the perspective what you think other countries might have.
So I'll start with that and you go. So first of all, we just have to keep in mind, every country in the world is protective of their farmers. When we talk about agricultural trade, protection is the word. That everybody does that everywhere in the world. We do that in some cases, but we're also the most open market in the world as well. So that's why we have a trade deficit in ag. We import a huge amount of fruits and vegetables and all kinds of things. But the best example that's simple that we can talk about here is the time I spent with the Indonesian trade minister. And we were talking to him about apples. And we're like, why won't you take our apples from Washington State, et cetera, into Indonesia? And when you sat down and visited with him for a while and began to understand what they were doing, it immediately became clear. They wanted no Chinese apples because they saw them as having pesticide-laden, whatever. You know, they created this huge mechanism internally to keep out Chinese apples. Well, what happened? We were getting caught in the net. They weren't intentionally trying to keep us out, but in the mechanism they created, we got caught. So I actually invited the Indonesian trade minister to go out to Washington State. He and I went out there and traveled around for a while. And what we showed him, he was so impressed. A month later, he brought his regulators from Indonesia, and he gave the tour, and I went with him again. He's like, look at what they do. See how they do this? And my point is, okay, how can we kind of change some holes in the net that you let us through? We get what you're doing with China. We don't have a problem with that. That's not the issue. But you got to let us through. We're not doing all that stuff. I think it's a classic example of some of the issues that we face in the world of ag trade.
Okay. I think one of the areas we need to be cautious of, and we need to pay attention to what's going on in Europe. I mean, everybody witnessed last winter the tractor parades or protests that took place across Europe. That's a good sign of, be careful what you ask for. I happened to be in London for some meetings with a group I work with there, and went down and spent a little time in Germany and a little bit in Denmark. And it's clear that these farmers continue to ask for more subsidies. And what happens with that? More control. So, we're seeing it. Europe is probably going to be a net food importer at some point in time here in general. But we are right now, I guess, too. But when I look at it's because of their policies they have there. But they want to push these policies around the world. So it's just like our Climate Green initiative here. What we're trying to do with producing more power with solar and wind. I've got a lot of these irrigation systems back in Indiana, and they run on electric. I can tell you if my power goes from 13 cents a kilowatt hour to 35 cents a kilowatt hour, am I going to be competitive in the global market space in producing corn, soybeans, and seed corn products? Probably not. So we've got to be careful what we do here at home in terms of policy, and that's why everybody in this room, you need to be active with your members in the Senate and the House and talk at the state level as well. Get engaged in that conversation, because if we don't, the policies that are coming from the Biden-Harris administration or the Harris-Walz administration, if they're elected, will come in and really slow our competitiveness in the world marketplace.
We in Nebraska are proud to export center pivot systems from Nebraska to Indiana, just incidentally.
I'm a big buyer.
I won't put you on the spot and ask you which your favorite brand is, but so disputes, inevitably they come up. Sometimes I feel like other countries, they're just in a posture of let's see what we can get away with. And just to fill you in, if you don't already know about the dispute with Mexico and biotech corn, more than 2 years ago, and we're narrowing in on 3 years now, that Mexico issued their decree that for cultural reasons, not scientific, we know that, that's impossible, but for cultural reasons, the government of Mexico is saying that biotech corn should not be accepted for human consumption. Now, I was told by various Biden officials that we're working on this. We're working on this. We probably won't even need to get to an official, formal dispute, but we'll get this resolved. Well, more than 2 years passed before the Biden administration even decided to form the panel for the dispute. Now that seems kind of clunky, even as much of a fan of USMCA as I am, but can you speak to dispute resolution and what you think maybe we should consider moving forward to iron out, in general, obviously this pending case with Mexico speaks for itself, but what should we think of moving forward in terms of dispute resolution?
So this is a graduate level semester course, okay? So we're going to try to do this in about 3 minutes here, okay? So there was a very famous Nebraskan by the name of Clayton Yiter that said that we need to have dispute resolution globally at the WTO, and he invented a mechanism to have a panel of experts to look at this that were from the outside and not involved and say, we're going to look at all this and we're going to decide. We're going to be the arbiter of who's right and who's wrong in all of this. And it worked for many, many years until what happened? Well, what happens with bureaucrats that have power? What happens? Suddenly they know more than everybody else. And so what began to happen with these panelists at the WTO is they began to create their own laws and their own rules out of whole cloth. Well, this is how we think, these two countries, and issuing a situation over solar panels, how to do this. Well, what happened? It began to unravel and create a huge mess, and folks couldn't figure out who won and lost, and you couldn't do it. So my boss, Ambassador Lighthizer, who's one of the great trade lawyers in the world, cut his teeth in the steel industry, and everybody freaked out about it. He came in and blew it all up and said, you know what, this just doesn't work anymore. From personal experience, he knew. Now, there's huge arguments in the world. By the way, what did the world learn? Well, that really didn't cause as much trouble as everybody thought it did. What Ambassador Lighthizer, if he was standing here, what he would tell you is, we need to go back to a system where if you have all this and you reach, he won and she lost or whatever, then the two countries arbitrate it out and have a negotiation to sort it out, and maybe have some people there to kind of help facilitate that. This has to be reinvented, because really what's happened is the whole system has gone to seed. What we tried with USMCA, so that process with NAFTA was a disaster. It didn't work. And it was actually a guy by the name of Ambassador C.J. Mahoney from Russell, Kansas, really smart guy, Harvard and Yale, with Ambassador Lighthizer, reinvented all this within USMCA, Canada, the US, and Mexico. So the first one was dairy with Canada, and we recreated this way to make it a lot faster. It's extremely challenging to do this. What you're talking about is how do you get the critical pieces in place with regard to Mexico. And part of the problem with this in Mexico, Congressman, is, well, Mexico actually hasn't done anything yet. So if the robber's wearing a mask standing outside the bank, but he hadn't actually walked in the bank yet, you really can't do anything about it. And so that's kind of where we are with Mexico. They're talking about it. We're watching them. We're having lots of conversations. But this is a very highly charged political issue with white corn and the political base of the party in power in Mexico, the Moreno Party. This is their political base. This is good populist politics for them. We still don't know at the end of the day if there's going to be, so far I don't think there's been too much of a trade impediment here. We're continuing to walk on it, look at it.
We're looking at months-long language interpretation.
Right.
That, I mean, good grief, we've got technology for real-time interpretation. We don't need to wait several months, but that's what they're utilizing.
So hope that gives you a flavor of it. This is complicated. This is not easy stuff to do. Can I tell you a great story? So every night we would sit with Ambassador Lighthizer. There were 11 political people. I was the only non-lawyer in the room, and these were mostly Ivy League lawyers. And they were having one of these conversations in Bob, you know the story, in Bob's office one night. And Bob looked over at me and literally saw my eyes roll in the back of my head about all this. And he looked over and he goes, how does a pig farmer from Kansas get in this room? And I looked at him back, I said, that's a hell of a good question, boss. I don't know either. Because even he realized, holy moly, this is really, really complicated stuff.
Yeah. You want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add on that. Greg was dealing with that and understood a lot of it. The only thing I see is the impact. I think Nebraska is the #1 exporter into Mexico on corn right now, and I see that. We produce seed corn for a major brand, and I know that seed corn is being used to produce corn here in Nebraska that goes on into Mexico, of course. So it's a big deal for all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think this current administration kept kicking the can down the road and not addressing this earlier on when it should have been addressed. And That's why we're at where we're at today. So I hope we can find some resolve here and get back in.
I've even tried to make the point to, and I've asked Ambassador Tai, our USTR right now for President Biden, to just get President Biden to say something. It's okay, that she goes and she works on it. I get that. That's important. It's okay that our ag secretary, he goes and works on it. That's important too. But there's nothing like the president taking a podium anywhere. If it happened to be in front of corn stalks, that's great. Not even necessary. He's chosen not to. I think that's a choice that President Biden has made, that I'm told that he's been briefed on the situation, and yet he's talked about his high school lifeguarding days, but not a very significant trade dispute with our neighbor in a freshly passed and agreed upon trade agreement such as USMCA. So sorry to dominate the time there, but that's frustrating for me as a representative of a lot of producers who are impacted by this, and certainly as my role leading the trade subcommittee in the interest that we have as a country, as a civilization, as a leader in the world on trade, that this is important stuff. So,
well, I would follow up on that. How did we make the progress that we did? It was simply because it was one of the most important priorities of the previous president. And when another country knows that, they know that they don't want to get on the wrong foot with the biggest economy in the world. They know that they export a lot of things to the United States. They know their economy is reliant on this. They don't want to be, out of sync here. Okay, what do we, so we had these conversations with Indonesia on some of this stuff. They said, you're messing up here. Their trade minister was in our office in 2 weeks. What do we need to do here? But it was because of the pressure from on high, at the top of the world that brought this about. That's your point.
Right, and we talk about what is the role of Congress, what's the role of president, where does that meet, the intersection, because it makes us as elected officials, as we engage with our constituents, and congressional influence and prerogative is important. That helps us move our country along constitutionally, and then to see, I think, such an absence of advocacy from our current president that would actually help our producers, and even more than that, help our consumers too. That it's a missed opportunity that I just wish that our current president would engage more.
I'll add just a little bit more to that. And I really don't, I look at what went on when Greg was serving in Washington and Lighthizer, and I looked at what was going on with Sonny Perdue over at USDA. We focused on what drove value back to agriculture and the U.S. economy. And today I can say that I don't see that same thing going on today. I mean, we heard some numbers on how our trade has declined. We know it's going to be down nearly $17 billion just this fiscal year alone. But we're more focused on green climate initiatives and some of the other things that goes on in this administration. So we need to get back to the basics, get back to trade, trying to promote our products around the world and make sure that we have an agriculture that's resilient and durable, and make sure we have trade partners understanding that.
Yeah, and it's my speculation that some of our fiercest trade competitors, they're saying behind the scenes, you go right ahead to us. You go right ahead and obsess about the green agenda. They're not going to take that approach. They haven't yet. and then, well, I won't get into all that. The previous panel did a great job of explaining some of that. But I just hope that we seize opportunities. And we haven't been seeing that. But as we are heading now into a new farm bill, can you speak a little bit to the MAP and FMD, basically trade promotion within the Farm Bill context?
Take that one. Go ahead.
So we over breakfast this morning, this subject came up, and I have the perfect analogy, Congressman. What if Cornhusker football said, you know what, we don't need a recruiting department, we're done. We're just going to rest on our laurels of Nebraska football. Everybody wants to play for Nebraska football. That ought to suffice. How do you think that'd work? Well, maybe a couple people
The
would go
jury's
along.
still out on that. by
Yeah,
the way.
exactly. Meanwhile, the rest of the world, and especially the Europeans, I mean, they're promoting and NILing, and they're going all around the world.
Right.
They work this hard, and they've been doing it for a long time. Folks, you've got to fight fire with fire. Do you realize in our MAP and FMD program that we use to promote exports, we haven't increased that amount of money in 18 years? Now, we are making some changes to that now, but you're behind the curve. You're behind the 8 ball in that whole conversation. There's a war going on out there for these customers. Let me tell you, the Brazilians, they take no prisoners. They're going at you with everything that they have. The Europeans, etc. This is what you have to do to be competitive in the world we live in today for your products that we're trying to move around the world. And for corn and soybeans, we know how much we move around the world. Most people don't realize we export 18% of our dairy today. So even dairy the export side of this is a huge piece of the puzzle.
That makes Canada really nervous.
You know,
I live to make Canada nervous in agriculture. I think that's a great thing.
you know, we know that U.S. agriculture is going to probably be down about 25 to 30% in revenues this year. I mean, you look at the map across the United States, there's some places it's going to be down nearly 40%. But when you look at the U.S. as an average from 22 to 24, we're down 40% right now. So what do we do to remedy that? Yeah, granted, we've had great production in the United States and other places around the world, but one of the things I think we need to all continue to do is focus more on value-add opportunities. That's where we're going to get that growth in that export market. Because I've been all across Brazil. We used to have operations in Argentina one time. Their competitiveness in producing a raw commodity is one thing, but their ability to invest in value-add has been very limited. So if there's one thing you take away from this today, it's make sure we support any value-add opportunities. Like you got a big packing house coming in the west side of the state. Biofuels is another great example of how we can continue to grow our economies and local communities. There's many of those, and we need to continue to invest and push hard and make sure we bring those into our local economies. But at the same time, that helps us export as well.
So many of you have seen, I've given a lot of speeches over the last few years since I've left the government. The punchline of the presentation is very simple. If you look out over the next 10 years, the supply of animal protein in the world, beef, pork, poultry, dairy, comes nowhere near meeting the demand. Nowhere near it. And if you look at the rest of the world in terms of animal agriculture and who's producing what you quickly understand is there's only one place on planet Earth that can grow and expand and meet that demand. And it's right here. So this is a clear message to all of us is let's go. The opportunity for us on the protein side of the world is there for us for the taking. Let's get after it.
But Greg, as you just said, but we know there's people on the opposite side of that. They don't want to see animal agriculture grow, whether it's a green climate initiatives or their fear of CAFOs and everything like that. This is why, again, your voice is so important and your support of Senator Ricketts and the congressman to make sure that we can have a thriving agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And when we talk about livestock agriculture and various regulations that some, particularly California, they like to implement, I would argue that if what's happening, say, in California, where they want the animal rights agenda basically increases the cost of protein. If you took that delta caused by regulations and you proposed the same amount in the form of a cut to SNAP and food stamps, the same folks would come unglued. And yet that's the practical impact that impacts the folks who can afford this the least.
Well, that doesn't say that we are not making things better in terms of the environment and what we do. Right. But we use a very different approach in the U.S. than the Europeans, in particular, in most places around the world. Why do you have farmers rioting on the highways of Europe? Because they use a stick approach. They use mandates and tell every farmer, you have to do this or you're not allowed to be involved. In the United States, we use incentives. We use what we call carrots. Here's the incentive, here's the goal we want to be, and all of you are great at saying, well, I can get to that point, I can adapt that in a way that I actually make more money, not less. And it's involving the use of technology. And that is really our business model on U.S. agricultural folks, is technology. We have the drop on the rest of the world with regard to the use of technology, whether it's seed, whether it's methane digesters, whatever it is. And when you add regulation and regulatory red tape on top of that, that's really where it hurts us in terms of our ability to expand and grow and meet the demand in the world.
You know, my father passed away about 2.5 years ago in February, and 3 days before he passed, he stayed at home the whole time, and he was active. He ran through the finish line, actually, but he said, let's go down the farm one more time. So he and I hopped in the pickup truck, and we went down the first farm where he farmed behind his father, walked into furrow, and where I walked into furrow behind him when I was a child. We got back out of the field, we sat on a rock for a little bit, and we just talked about life and farming, and he said, you know what this field yielded when I was a young boy of corn? I said, no, what? He said, 32 bushel per acre. And he said, and he turned to me again, he said, what did it do this year? I said, well, about 240. Well, that's agriculture innovation at its finest, 8-fold increase, just in the United States. So we got to continue that innovation, but it needs to come from the private sector. We got to stop asking the government to do everything for us. Let's let the private sector thrive like they need to. But we have one comment is this. Always remember this, and let's keep it this way. The U.S. innovates, China replicates, and the EU regulates. So keep that in mind. Let's make sure we continue to be the innovators and not the regulators.
Well, that's right. And that's how I think we have become so efficient in terms of agriculture, being able to produce high quality for an affordable amount, and scientifically strong and safe. And so these political disputes in other countries, whether it's the EU, oftentimes in Asia as well, we have to get through that. But technology, our technological inputs to agriculture depend a lot on trade as well. As you touched on earlier, the supply chains, I just can't say enough that we want policies that encourage more innovation. That's the answer. Whether it's energy, as discussed in the prior panel, whether it's affordability overall and access. There are so many things moving together that we want ultimately consumers to have access, but consumers won't have access if producers can't get it either. So there's just a lot of moving parts here. So, and I look out over the audience, a lot of familiar faces. We've discussed MAP funding, FMD, and just various perspectives and how important it is to ultimately promote our product. And these guys both have the lifetime title of ambassador. Now I hope you re-enter the arena again because of your very successful service. One thing I want to point out is even though these guys' jobs were very different one from another, they were both advocating for us, for you as producers, for us as consumers. And we spend a lot of taxpayer dollars. Not just on ambassador salaries, those are pretty modest, but overall making sure that we keep the ball rolling in advocacy. And so basically every embassy around the country has much more than a single ambassador and some consular officers who are dealing with visas, for example. When I visited Japan on a trade trip a while ago, but our ag guy there in the Foreign Ag Service, he was a champion. Yep. We talked a lot about beef for that particular occasion, but these are champions for all of us. And if there's one thing I want to make clear, we are all in this together. Now, producers have a little more at stake. I certainly want to note that and tell you how much I appreciate that. But there are so many opportunities out there. I hope that we can work together to take advantage of those opportunities, bring more prosperity here to the home front for producers, but also as American consumers, we can thrive as well when things are clicking the way we want them to. Thank you again for being here, for sharing your expertise, but certainly for sharing in your service for so long. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
Thanks.
All right, was that a great panel about trade and the importance of trade and what we've got to do in the future? Wasn't that a good deal? Yeah. Let's make sure let's give the ambassadors another round of applause. They were just doing a great job. Well, one of the things I appreciated about what they said was, and the Ambassador Tom said this, is the key takeaway there is value-added agriculture, where we have a competitive advantage over some of the other countries that are out there selling their agricultural products in the market. You know, for example, if you look at places like Brazil, where they have the opportunity to get, plant twice a year versus what we can do here, they're going to be able to produce a lot more. But if we can find value-added agriculture, that's one of the ways that we can compete in a growing world. And I love the fact that what they hit upon was livestock, because that's an important value-added agriculture, right? If you can walk that grain off the farm, as one rancher told me, you're going to have a lot more value into that. You're going to be able to make more money off of that. And so that's one of the things, obviously, we do very well here in Nebraska with our industries. Obviously, we've done a lot for the cattle industry, for the pork industry. We're seeing growth in the poultry industry here in the state of Nebraska. That's all good stuff that we should continue to promote and focus on, which is, again, why trade is so important that they're talking about. And so this next panel, we're going to actually continue that, talking about agribusiness here in Nebraska. And we're going to have some people who are talking about that value-added agriculture. We've got 3 great panelists who are going to be coming up here today to talk about their businesses, their operations, what they're doing, and some of the challenges they face and some of the opportunities we have to be able to expand them going further. So our first guest, I'm very excited to have all these panelists up here, is Buck Wehrbein. He grew up in eastern Nebraska, raising cattle, hogs, and chickens. He started feeding his own cattle in 1980, and then got into the feeding cattle in custom feedlots in 1984, both in Nebraska and Texas. In fact, he spent some of his time down in Amarillo, Texas, feeding cattle before he came back to the state of Nebraska. He's been very active in the beef industry, served as both the chairman and the treasurer for the Nebraska Beef Council. He's also served on the Beef Promotion Operating Committee. And he and his wife Sandy have been married for 50 years. They have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. So he is going to be one of our panelists that comes up. Then we're also going to have Rusty Kemp. Rusty Kemp is the founder, he's a rancher from McPherson County, but he's also the founder of Sustainable Beef. And that's a very important value-added agricultural thing here. He's working with his wife Rachel and his 2 sons Cash and Tucker. But they're creating this $400 million investment to be able to process beef here in the state of Nebraska. So located in North Platte, Nebraska, that's going to be an important thing for us to be able to, again, process that beef here in the state, create more competition in that industry. He and his wife and sons also raise export-eligible natural feeder cattle. And this investment is about a $400 million investment that will have over $1 billion impact in our state of Nebraska. And then finally, we're going to have Chuck Woodside. Chuck has been the Chief Operating Officer for Kappa Ethanol since 2002. Kappa is Nebraska's largest farmer-owned ethanol company. Oh, okay, we got some, yeah, there we go. All right. They've got ethanol facilities in Minden, Ravenna, and Aurora. These facilities produce 350 million gallons of ethanol annually, along with grain elevator operations in Elm Creek, Nebraska. Chuck has also served as the chairman of the board of directors for the Renewable Fuels Association, the nation's largest and oldest ethanol trade organization. He previously served as a chairman of Renewable Products Marketing Group, the nation's 3rd largest ethanol marketer. Chuck is a native of Lexington. He has an ag economics degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He and his wife Linda live in Kearney, and they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. And, oh good, they're all here. So please welcome all 3 of our great panelists to the stage here. Yeah, sit down, right? Well, hey, gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us here today. I very much appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to talk about agribusiness here in Nebraska. So just to start with, obviously I gave some brief introductory remarks, but let's just talk a little bit about your operations, your organizations, what you're doing, and just give the audience a little bit of an overview of how it's important for Nebraska agriculture. And so Chuck,
Sure.
we'll start with you.
We just celebrated our 20th year of production last year with our original plant in Minden, Nebraska. So, as was mentioned, we're the largest farmer-owned ethanol company in Nebraska. All of those, thanks, Mom. No, just kidding. No, we have just over 500 stockholders that mostly are in the state of Nebraska. And so our profits stay in Nebraska. We have 180 employees and operate 3 ethanol facilities and 1 grain elevator in central Nebraska.
Great. Buck?
Yeah, Buck Wardbine, I operate a feedlot in Meade, Nebraska, a low-income feedlot, I might add. And so obviously we're producing high-quality beef for the world and the country and our state. And all of these things that have been talked about today, including trade and regulation and so forth, are very, very important to us. So looking forward to visiting about that.
Great. Rusty?
Rusty Kemp, I'm from Tryon, Nebraska, which is in McPherson County. Run a cow-calf yearling operation with my wife, Rachel. Our son, Cash, is now back on the operation helping us, and we're very happy to have him there. My youngest son, Tucker, is a sophomore in high school. In 2019, I started a little company called Sustainable Beef, which is a 400,000 head a year beef processing plant that we're currently building in North Platte. Plan on having our ribbon cutting March 24th, if any of you want to come, and should start processing cattle hopefully in April. And this guy here is a big part of that whole deal.
Well, and Rusty, you guys are ahead of schedule in your construction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, how often do you hear that? Like a construction project is ahead of schedule. So what I'd like to start off talking about with is how do you stay up on government regulations, both federal and state, and what are some of your biggest challenges when it comes to the regulatory environment? Go ahead, Chuck. We'll start
Yeah,
with you.
absolutely. So a key part of that function for us is association membership. At the national level, that's the Renewable Fuels Association. And at the state level, it's the Renewable Fuels Nebraska. And we count on them to keep a pulse on the things that are going on in Lincoln and in Washington. And that's a really key piece of our business in staying up. And as far as dealing with that, I think just the change and making sure the understanding the regulations is a big part of that.
So how do you keep up with the change in the understanding regulations? I mean, how do you overcome that part of it?
So we end up retaining a lot of consultants and that help us kind of go through the maze and find the right gates.
Buck?
Yeah, association work is really important. And we lived in Texas. I was on Texas Cattle Feeders Board and Nebraska Cattlemen and now NCBA. And so that's a great resource to keep up with what's going on. And then being plugged into people in the business, people in Washington like you. And it's really difficult because as you read, you can get on the internet and look up anything you want to, but trying to go through the maze of what's said versus what's true is really difficult. And so it's finding the network of folks that you trust, know that they're going to tell you the truth, whatever it is. And a big part of that is association. The NCBA is an important component for me.
Number one for us would be Nebraska Cattlemen. I'm happy to see them back there, great smiles. They're absolutely, couldn't keep track of it without them. They do a great job. The only frustration I have is the more ranchers need to be participating in that organization. We run into a lot of people that don't get their way on one thing, and they take their ball and go home for about 10 years till another topic comes up that they're interested in.
All right. So now what I'd like the three of you to talk about is the regulatory headaches that you face. So what do you see out there as the risks, the biggest regulatory risks to your respective industries, and What do you see as a risk in general for agriculture here coming down the road? And Rusty, maybe we'll just start with you.
Biggest risk I see is we absolutely have to keep control of our water here in Nebraska for irrigation, for cattle, for everything. And you get the waters of the United States acts coming in that they're going to take control of a water hole in one of my pastures. That's the absolutely most critical #1 resource we have in Nebraska is water.
And that's incredibly important. And also, I would say uncertainty going forward, not knowing what's coming. You have waters in the United States. The Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Act, I think, was 1921. Maybe the last time there was a budget came out of Washington. And it worked just fine. And then the Obama administration started tinkering with it and coming up with ideas. And CBA worked very hard at getting it to stay, leave it alone. But, we deal with these things, and it's like spraying weeds. You keep spraying for them, they keep coming back. And that's when GIPSA, some of the new ideas they have on guaranteeing outcomes rather than opportunities is making it very difficult to defend yourself if someone decides to sue you. And so they've got some wording that would allow an animal activist, anti-animal agriculture activist, to get in and be called a producer and things like that. A lot of uncertainty going forward that I think is an issue.
Well, I want you to expand on that a little bit too, from the standpoint of what did you see from the Obama administration to the Trump administration and now to the Biden administration? Did you have a different philosophy across those administrations on this regulatory issue?
Yeah, night and day. The Obama administration, took it, they got off the path by 3/4 of a mile, and the Trump administration got back on it and left it alone. And now this administration is 1.5 miles off the road and wanting to improve things like GIPSA. And so, it's why you have to be part of an association that is looking after that, because we can't do it ourselves. And they'll eviscerate us.
I absolutely agree. The uncertainty is really difficult, and not just the uncertainty, but the timing of when we're supposed to get regulations compared to when we're supposed to have things implemented by. Originally there was a part of the Inflation Reduction Act which instituted a 45Q regulation. It was to reward climate smart agriculture, and yet it was started in 25. But the crop that's growing that's going to be dependent on meeting those climate smart ags already is in the field and getting ready to be harvested. And that's incredibly difficult to try and meet meet the obligations under there, or meet the intent of that without having the rules.
Yeah. Well, Chuck, why don't you talk a little bit more about that uncertainty and what it actually means for your company? You could work in the RVOs that the EPA puts out every year. But talk a little bit about that and how it makes a difference for you. Because when I talk to businesses, the single biggest things they want to know is just what you all said, is certainty. It's like, tell me what the rules are, and I'll play by those rules. I'll figure out how to make it work. But you got to tell me what the rules are. You can't keep changing. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit more.
A couple great examples. The RVOs are a perfect one. This is part of the renewable fuel standard, which, by statute, these rules were supposed to be made, I think, by the end of this. Well, the regulations were supposed to be out by it's for a 26 RVO. Regulations were supposed to be out, I think, by the end of this year, and now it doesn't look like we're going to get the actual RVOs until the first part of next year, and maybe then. Back to the point I made about 45Q. It's a program under statute that I'll go one step further, and I think you actually were such an important part of the plan on this. And this was the 8-state governor request to waive the 1 pound waiver. And I think the advancement that it made to statewide or to nationwide E15 is tremendous. But the fact is that you submitted a request to EPA to to no longer allow the 1 pound waiver. And I think you were supposed to hear in 180 days, and that started under your term as governor. And I think it took over 2 years to get an answer from the EPA.
And that just kind of emphasized what Shelley Capito was saying earlier, that we have these deadlines for the EPA to be able to respond and get back to business, to give them that kind of certainty, and then they ignore the law. They absolutely ignore the law. So when you hear me say things like this lawless administration, this is one of the things we're talking about. It may seem like just kind of a little bureaucratic detail or whatever, but it actually makes a big difference to our producers, our companies here in Nebraska, to be able to have that certainty, to be able to go forward. So talk to me a little bit about the cost of this. So Chuck, can you tell me, like, you know, I'm not asking you to give us your P&L, but talk a little bit about, like, what does it mean for you? What kind of cost do you have to incur? What kind of cost do you have to pass on to your customers when you don't have the certainty, when you have these regulations that are coming down and you don't have any control over it?
So just the cost of compliance and making sure that we're abreast of those for our company would exceed $500,000 a year. By the time we, comply with everything, I think, but that doesn't include the cost. We're an LLC, so we pass along our income obligation to our stockholders, and they have to then comply. So it doesn't begin to touch the cost of having to go back and amend your returns and some of these other things.
So you think it costs, just complying with regulations generally costs you about $500,000?
That's easy to come to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It would be more than that.
Because that's just the hiring the people, the watching all the regulations and that
That's
sort
right.
of thing. What about the cost of the uncertainty of not knowing, for example, what the RVOs are going to be? Can you?
So I think that's a real, those numbers would make the earlier numbers seem smaller, because as an industry today, as we plan for decarbonization, we are planning millions of dollars of investments, and we are not yet sure what rules we need to comply with or what we need to do to be able to meet those obligations. So it is, depending upon what your plans are, it gets into the millions and tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and then one of the things too, just as we're touching on RVOs here too, one of the frustrations I had is when the administration would put out RVOs for things like biodiesel, and the industry was already producing more of that than their RVO threshold was. It's like, guys, we know we can already produce more than this. Why are you setting it below that? Which is incredibly frustrating. But can you talk a little bit about regulations, the cost of compliance?
Yeah, it doesn't cost us that much because we don't make the money that ethanol costs. It's not that bad, but it's expensive. It's interesting too, because it's caused some cottage industries to come along. There are groups that help you with your compliance, and the problem is you can be doing everything right, and if your records aren't right, it can be a $25,000 fine. So,
just right there. Yeah.
There's some direct costs like that you actually write a check for, and in the cattle business, we're a lot better at getting the work done than we are at recording and all that kind of stuff. And so there's some direct costs like that, but then there's also things that you spend on your plant and so forth and whatnot. Back in the day when the NPDES permits came out that all CAFOs over 1,000 head had to have, that was a lot of money. And in fact, if they ever get back down to the truly small producers under 1,000 head, they probably will go out of business like the mom and pop filling stations did that had to dig up their underground tanks and so forth. Right. So it's something that you can find in your checkbook, and then it's also a lot of time and effort and so forth that maybe you don't book.
Right, but it still costs you that time and effort, which is a cost
Absolutely.
that then gets passed on to the consumer, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, Rusty, you've got a little different perspective here. You're building a processing plant in North Platte. You talked about the 400,000 head a year. It's really, a fantastic addition to the state of Nebraska. What sort of regulatory challenges have you had with regard to that plant? I mean, you must be doing something right because you guys are ahead of schedule. But what kind of challenges do you see? What are the things that you're going to have to deal with as running a meat processing plant?
The biggest challenge we have is we budgeted $300 million to build this plant, and it's taken $400 million. So just the inflationary environment we're in, and then you tack the higher interest rate on top of that, and it's just, I think we're going to get it done, but it's I'm glad we didn't know how hard it was going to be, or we probably wouldn't have started.
Have you had any challenge? Like, it's okay. We can also say nice thing, good things too. But have you had challenges with getting permits and that sort of thing? And then maybe you could talk also a little about, like, once you're in operation, OSHA compliance and that sort of stuff. Have you guys like mapped all that stuff out?
Yeah, I'm just some cowboy. We got people taking care of that for me. But the permitting process that we went through, we had an engineering firm, and if you follow all the rules and do it the way they want to, they have to permit you. So we didn't really have any trouble with that, but we spent a lot of money on some really smart people to help us through that.
So do you have any idea of like what percentage of the total cost of the build that was, or how much you like checked throughout the $500,000?
If you want to count the inflation, about $100 million.
Wow. Just on getting the whole permitting and everything else
Yeah,
together?
well, just the inflationary environment we're in now, because of what we talked about earlier. They're dropping $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there.
Right.
That's been a big challenge.
So again, getting back to what you're saying, then as part of the challenge is, if I hear what you're saying, is that because this Biden administration has sparked this inflation, it added fully a third onto the cost of what you thought was going to cost to build this thing.
Absolutely. Plus the interest costs we're incurring because the Fed has bumped this interest rate up to try to beat back the inflation that they caused in the first place. Kind of feel like we're in a circle here. But.
Right, so it's kind of a double whammy there. So the overspending, things like the American Rescue Plan Act, the Inflation Reduction Plan, all the act that all created this inflation by spending all this money, and then the Fed comes in to start taking interest rates higher to drive down inflation, and so you get hit twice.
Yeah, you're getting hit from both sides.
Yep.
And that affects my ranching business too. Everything's gone up by a third. If you used to be able to operate on $3 million, now it takes $4 million. We're a very capital intensive industry, and this inflation plus the interest rates is it's probably going to take out some of the smaller producers that they purport to support.
So now, what do you see as other risks out there? We talked about inflation, we talked about interest rates. What are some other risks out there as you look down the road, either to your cattle operation or to the processing plant? As you look down the road, what do you see as other risks might be out there for agriculture?
Back to their point earlier, what are the rules, the uncertainty? And usually if there's uncertainty, things just don't happen. If you kind of know the rules, what the world is you're going to operate in, you can deal with that, and you'll maybe make that investment or make that capital investment. But if you don't know what's going to happen, it's just easier to sit still and not innovate and not grow.
Now, so when you're looking at your operation, we had some folks on the previous panel who were talking about trade. How do you see the trade impacting your operation here?
Yeah, Obama gave all of our export quotas to the Brazilians when he was in office. We export quite a bit of beef, and we export quite a bit of most of the offal. People from other countries eat stuff we don't eat, but it's very frustrating. When you and I were in London, we had a reception at the ambassador's residence, and talking to all the British people, they had just went through Brexit. They're not in the European Union. They want to do a trade deal with us, and they all speak English. They're in the Anglosphere. There's 70 million of them. They've got money, and they said the Biden administration won't even answer their calls.
Yeah.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things we've seen with the Biden administration. They are not really doing anything on trade to be able to help promote trade. And that, a free trade agreement with the UK is a great example. It's like, we should be in there. We should be trying to get this thing done so that there's a market of 70 million people who want to buy our products. And I think the other thing I heard from Ambassador Dowd earlier in a different conversation, talking about when the Biden administration came in, they really stopped engagement on trade with China. And the Trump administration was very successful in getting more ag exports to China with their phase 1 trade agreement. That's a big deal to be able to do that. So. And then finally, what you just said there, Rusty, about there's parts of the animals that we don't use a lot of here. like tongue would be a good example, wouldn't it? But they love it in Japan, right? So they'll pay a higher price for it than we can get for it here. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's some of the benefits of trade, and when we see an administration again that isn't focusing on trade, and we're going to have a projected $32 billion agricultural trade deficit this year, and it was $16 billion last year. And like I said, first time, well, that would only be the fourth time in 50 years we've had an agricultural trade deficit. It's because this Biden administration is not going out there and trying to find those trade opportunities. Buck, can you talk a little bit about that from what you see from the Nebraska Beef Council and trade and the opportunities there and what it means for your industry?
Yeah, we went on 2 trade missions together, and you were a great advocate for the state and the people of the state and our products. And trade is a huge part of our life in the cattle business. And so we have great trade. The people love our product. Our product's gotten better and better. And so that is all good. But your country, your government also needs to be supportive of it. And that's certainly not the case right now. I don't, like some things, I feel like they're working against us. I don't think that on trade, but they're not pushing for it like you did as governor here. And so that's something that for us going forward, as we mentioned, the products that we don't use, and then we need products to come back in. You know, there's 200 pounds of 50-50 trimmings on every animal, something like that. You know better than I do. 50% fat, 50%. You need some lean meat to blend with that for the good flavor and make a high quality product. So we need imports too, not just the exports. So trade is a large part of what we do. We used to export 10% of our product, and it's more like 12 or 14% now. So big deal. Yeah. And once again, the uncertainty, just to touch on one other thing that is very uncertain, is transportation. The inflation and cost of fuel and whatnot has added so much cost to what we do. When you bring cattle out of the Southeast or Canada or wherever, a lot of freight on them. So that's added a lot of costs for us. And then you don't know, we keep fighting off the hours of service because it's a long trip from Okeechobee, Florida to Nebraska. And so, so far we've kept that at bay, but we don't know when that might get dumped on us to where you have to have 2 drivers and things like that. And I'm off topic here.
No, you're on topic. This is exactly what we want to talk about, is the risk to agriculture.
Okay. And so one of the frustrating things, and that's Washington in general, not just this administration, is they've got a solution and now they're looking for the problem. You know, animal transportation is not a problem, but they're going to fix it. And so that's frustrating. Yeah.
It was interesting because I was just talking to a daughter and a gentleman who were, she's like a bee queen, and she's here with the honey exhibit and that sort of thing. And they fought for years to be able to get bees included in agriculture because they actually had the same issue with regard to hours of service and transporting bees. I guess it's the same thing with bees and cattle. Like, you can't just pull over on the side of the road and let them sit there in a 90-degree or 100-degree day like this if you've missed your hours of service or whatever. You know, you got to make, for the animals' welfare, you've actually got to get them to their next location. Exactly. Chuck, maybe you could talk a little bit about ethanol industry, a little bit about trade, and how that impacts your industry, and what have you all been doing?
Yeah. So my best example of risks would be the tailpipe emission standards that the administration just put out. Effectively, that becomes an EV mandate if it's allowed to be in place. And while I don't think that anybody believes that we're going to get to that point, but I think at the same time, it creates questions, it creates a lot of uncertainty, and that's the kind of thing that we need to avoid.
Yeah. So. Well, we were talking about a little bit earlier with Ford announcing they're not going to make the F-150 electric, right? I think I just saw that article, and it's going to cost them like, I don't know, $1 billion, maybe $2 billion. But it gets back to the uncertainty of if they don't know what the regulations are going to be, and there's not the demand out there for it, and you've got this one-size-fits-all answer, kind of what you were talking about, Buck, of like just pushing down a regulation on us that's going to drive something that consumers don't want, certainly not consumers here in Nebraska. Well, that creates a big problem. Talk a little bit. So we've talked about some of the issues here with regard to agriculture. We've talked about regulation. We've talked about trade a little bit. Oh, do you want to talk a little bit about trade?
I just talked briefly about trade. I think one of the key pieces is making sure that we have good models with the latest information when we think about the carbon intensity of raising corn and how much improvements have been made on farm in the last 20 years, right? So I think just making sure that, and this level playing field has got to be there as well. I think about the tariffs that Brazil has in place on ethanol, and yet we continue to bring ethanol into the state of California without a tariff. And I think those are the kinds of things that are put us at risk.
Right. So Brazil has the trades on our ethanol going into Brazil, but we're not putting the same tariff on their ethanol coming here. And you got to ask yourself, why are we doing that? And what's the policy behind that?
May I build? It's very frustrating, just what you're talking about. And so understanding what's coming down the pike, what they're going to do, and I don't know that they know what they're going to do. But I think it was the senator maybe mentioned earlier, but science needs to drive this, whether it's EVs or whatever it is, and on trade and so forth. Mexico doesn't want our GMO corn. That's not based on science. And so we need to push for that. And that requires your government working hard, as Greg Dowd used to. I hate to compliment a guy from Kansas, but he did. And so it needs to be based on science. All of this does. And then we're fine. We can compete in any way, shape, or form, but science needs to be key.
So we've talked a little bit, like I said, about regulation and trade. Obviously, the government has a big role in this, and Buck, you mentioned it. Chuck, maybe you could talk a little bit. How have you found that you need to be involved or be engaged to be able to make sure we've got the right policy, whether it's trade policy, regulatory policy? Kind of talk about maybe what you do at RFA and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the Renewable Fuels Association has been a big part of our advocacy in Washington, D.C. and throughout. And that's not only from, discussions with our legislators and the people there, but also within the regulatory agencies. A good example is that there's some regulations, some rulemaking came out recently with respect to 40B and sustainable aviation fuel. And if you wanted to do climate smart agriculture under that, you had to do 3 practices, and you couldn't just do one of the 3, you had to do all 3. And the last thing we wanted to see was to have them come back with regulations under 45Z and have the same kind of rules in place. Because what works for a farmer here in Nebraska is not going to work for a farmer in Minnesota. And there's some other things with respect to book and claim that we think need to be put in place so that it isn't just benefit the farmer that's within 20 miles of the ethanol plant, right? And so we actually went back, but in that case, we met with the IRS, we met with the administration, we went with the USDA, the EPA, and the DOE all in 2 days. And it's the kind of thing where you've got to be active there. We need the advocates like you have always led, but then it takes that reinforcement face to face. And I think they appreciate it, or at least they act like they do when you're there. But we'll see how much attention they paid to it.
Right. So on that, what you're saying is when you say we, you're talking about the Renewable Fuels Association. So you're getting renewable fuels people from around the country to be able to go in and talk to the different agencies about this. And I think it also, because the 3 things you're supposed to do, like it was cover crops, no-till. Do you remember what the other one?
Mark's probably got it better.
Mark, come on, help us out here. But it was something, but you get the idea. But I think what it demonstrates is that the regulators who are making this, and I think that's what Administrator Wheeler was saying earlier, was that the bureaucrats who are doing this oftentimes haven't been to a farm. And they don't have any idea how these things actually work. To them, they're just phrases or buzzwords. And that's why it's so important that people will actually know what they're talking about, go in and talk to these agencies, or at least just try and create an awareness that they actually don't know what they're talking about when they're trying to push some of these things. So I think that's a really good point. Oh,
Just thinking about the whole environment and science and so on and so forth, We have not even been part of the Paris Accord or whatever it was on climate change and lowering greenhouse gases, yet we're the only country that's actually doing that.
Right.
And it's because the science and the economics tell you to do it, and so we are. You don't have to join these clubs of advanced nations that aren't even getting any of it done, and it happens on its own if you incentivize it with the economics.
Okay, so that's a great point, because I think that the last panel also was talking about, I think it was Greg Dowd said that, we do incentives to get people to follow the policies we're looking for, versus in Europe they use a stick, right? They tell you just mandate it. And yet your point is exactly right. If you look at the countries that are actually reducing their carbon emissions, we're doing it, and these countries in Europe are not, right? They're not actually doing it. They're talking all nice, they're doing their, agreements and stuff, but they're not actually getting the job done. Buck, do you have stories about, again, Chuck shared a story about like having to go in and advocate. Do you have a story with regard to similar regulations that the Beef Council was getting involved in, that you had to educate people about regulations that were coming down?
I would say the time of service for the drivers is one. I remember testifying before the Department of Justice. This is quite a while ago, maybe a decade ago, and that was about something they were pushing for, and it's kind of interesting, as you know better than anybody. The people in Washington are at once really quite brilliant, and also, I don't know how to say this, but
maybe lack common sense.
You can't get across town.
they're really smart, but they're not. And so, and a problem is this guy that we were talking to, Bill Rischel, was president of NC at the time, and he said, we were leaving and the meeting had gone well, and he said, I just want to tell you that we told the same things to a different guy last year. So, right. New guy, new boss, same as the old boss. And so I'm sorry, I can't remember what that specific issue was that we were dealing with, but it was something that they were pushing from the top down and made no sense, and we were trying to explain that to them.
Right.
And I don't know that we did any good, but we made an effort.
Right. Rusty, do you have a story or an example about advocacy? Or
I do. We were, the Biden administration had a bunch of money to expand actually meat packing in the United States, and we thought, boy, this sounds like a good fit for us. And so when you're on a Zoom call with the people in the USDA, they do not understand the first thing about agriculture.
They're in the USDA, they don't understand anything about agriculture.
They don't understand the basics about agriculture. They're not all cows. Some of them are steers, heifers, heiferettes, bulls. They think they're all cows. And, they genuinely wanted to help. They're nice people, but anyway, long story short, we didn't get any money. Greater Omaha got about $15 million because we think they thought they could flip that congressional seat. So maybe that's why the money went into that district.
So you're saying that it might have been more politically motivated? I mean, like maybe giving $50 million from the EPA to the Climate Justice Alliance to protest us in Washington, D.C. to have stricter environmental regulations.
Yeah, you had a group of farmers and ranchers that are doing exactly what this act is supposed to do, but they didn't get any of the money. But we got $20 million from you. Thanks.
Just so we're clear, that wasn't me personally.
We asked for $70 million.
Well, the first rule of sale, Rusty's always asked for the sale.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, though, that here we are, we have a program that was out there specifically to encourage more competition in the beef processing industry, the meat processing industry. And yet you are doing exactly what the administration wanted, like what the top line was, what we wanted people to do is create more competition, and yet you couldn't qualify to get the grant from the USDA. Isn't that crazy? What do you think is the best way to advocate then? So like, what do you think has been most effective?
Well, we were pretty ineffective, I think. It starts with, it's always personal relationships. I can call you or text you, and you always respond. And it's you just got to get involved. The world is run by the people that show up, and you've got to get involved in your local organizations. And sometimes we got to write a check, even though that's kind of hard to do. But it's personal relationships and get involved.
You mentioned the Farm Bill earlier, and the Farm Bill that came out of the House had basically everything we, NCBA, was looking for. And G.T. Thompson, Congressman Thompson, did a really good job, in our view, of shepherding that through that. And now, of course, it's in y'all's court, and we'll see where it goes there. But that's a good example of having built relationships over decades and building on that. And even with the agencies, the deep state, the bureaucrats that we talk about, the people on the line doing the work oftentimes recognize what's really needed, not necessarily what the administration wants, and they will work with the people who have worked with them. So your point about building relationships is really important.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to, again, being involved, being, again, it's run by the people who show up, right? And so it's so important to be involved. Chuck, anything to add to that?
No, again, we are so fortunate to have the congressional delegation that we do there, because the comment was made to me recently. Nebraska is the second largest ethanol producing state in the nation, behind Iowa. And Senator Grassley's always been a huge advocate, and their delegation has been really out in front. But a comment was made to me by a Washington person recently that said, the Nebraska delegation is replacing that with the personnel that we have in Washington. So thank you for your work and all the work that you've done, because it is important to be back there. It's important to be active, and so we continue to do that.
Okay, great. Well, we're kind of coming up on our time here. What I'd like to do is just give you all just a couple minutes each to kind of round up anything else that we didn't cover. It could be how energy policy impacts agriculture, anything on regulation you forgot, trade policy, but just anything that you want to wrap up with. And Chuck, maybe we'll start with you and then go back down the line.
I just like sharing the stage with the cattlemen, because I got to tell you, there are so many opportunities in Nebraska as we look at decarbonizing. And the fact is that our ethanol is penalized with all of the carbon from growing corn. And so all of the distillers' grains that goes into the feedlot should carry absolutely zero carbon intensity, except for the transportation to get it to the feedlot. And I don't think that's being recognized well enough. And I think that just creates a lot of opportunities for your customers that may, in fact, be looking to decarbonize as well. So we're excited about the partnership that we have with the cattlemen.
Yeah. The bovine is the greatest steward of the earth's resources because of what they can do with distillers' grains that you and I can't eat, and forage out there and turn it into high-quality protein. And so, what you're doing every day out there. And so there's Dr. Frank Mitlerner at Cal Davis has done a lot of work on this. And everybody ought to watch one of his little webinars or podcasts, whatever you call it. And he's got this great German accent. But anyway, he's really good at demonstrating why the cow is an answer and can be solving the climate problem, if there is one. Whether you believe it or not, the world kind of believes that there is. And so the cow and utilizing y'all's byproducts and so forth, big deal.
Yeah, I think in agriculture, in some ways we really punch above our weight, and in some ways we really need to do a better job of telling our story. One of the things that I think we really need to get out in front of, that the Europeans do a better job at than us, is beef needs to be beef. If you go into the dairy section of a grocery store now, it's not all milk. There's nut juice in there. And the Europeans do a very good job of, this has to be pork. This kind of cheese can only be labeled this way. And we are really behind on that. So
So again, what you're saying is making sure that, for example, that when we're saying it's beef, it's actually beef and not something maybe grown in a laboratory
that
someplace.
Impossible Burger should not be called a hamburger or
Yeah.
beef. You know, it's not, and we shouldn't let them label it that way.
And real quickly,
Yeah.
they're not supposed to. It's not supposed to be almond milk, soy milk. But the FDA has sway over that, and they just ignore it. That's why with the lab-grown protein, we want to make sure USDA, who actually might watch it, because they're not supposed to use those terms, and yet they do, because FDA just lets it go.
Yeah, they get away with it. Yeah. Well, great. Hey, I really appreciate everything that you all said about this. And I think one of the key drivers, key themes that you heard here is how important it is to be involved, and especially through your associations, whether it's the Beef Council, Renewable Fuels Association, Nebraska Cattlemen, Farm Bureau. We got Mark McCarg sitting here in the front row. Being involved is absolutely critical when you're looking to have an impact on policy, whether it's the state level or the federal level. The importance of showing up, making your voice heard, because the people in Washington, D.C. do not have a clue about what it's like to live in the middle part of the country here. They really, really don't. It's not necessarily malicious. It's just that, for example, as you heard from Ambassador Wheeler, or Administrator Wheeler, a lot of those folks have never been to a farm. They really don't know what it's like. And so, we just touched upon this EV mandate as well, but it's the same thing with that. My experience is, just talking to people in Washington, D.C., they don't get why everybody can't have an electric vehicle. Well, it's because not everybody lives in a big urban area where you can drive around and the weather's relatively mild and you've got chargers, right? That's not Nebraska. So part of that is why it's so important that we have folks like this out there in Washington, D.C. coming to help us as the federal delegation be able to tell the story and be able to help educate the bureaucrats, because they really, truly do not understand what the industry is about or what the impacts of what the rules are going to make are. Now, sometimes we do have bureaucrats that just have a total left-wing agenda. That's a completely different issue. But there's a lot of folks that we just need to be able to help educate so they can do better regulations and better rules. And frankly, when I was doing trade missions, our best ambassadors were our farmers and ranchers, because they were the original conservationists. They told a great story about where where your food comes from, and that's the story people wanted to hear. So I just want to thank all three of you for being here today. Really appreciate your insights on how rules and regulations and government impacts our Nebraska agriculture. This is the engine that drives our state economy, so it's important that we really protect agriculture from what they're trying to do in Washington, D.C. And you all do that all the time. So thank you very much. Let's give them a big round of applause. And folks, thank you very much for sharing our Federal Issues Forum today. You sat through almost 3 hours of great presentations. We had some great guests here. Really appreciate you all taking the time to learn about the different issues. And I hope you enjoy the rest of our beautiful state fair. Have a great afternoon.